Okay. So there's a few things we want to cover today. Part of that's going to be talking about something called Agile. There's a big part of that and some tools that go into that. I do have a fair number of slides to get through, and there are a few videos in here that we're going to probably watch. So just fair forewarning, we'll try to keep this fast-paced, but there's a bit to get through. Okay, so what we want to cover today, we're going to talk a little bit about the different roles that go into developing software, because there's a lot more than just writing the software. There's a lot more to that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about this term SDLC, which stands for Software Development Life Cycle. And then we'll get into, as we talk about that, we'll talk a little bit about what the Waterfall model is, as well as what Agile development is. Once we've kind of covered that, we'll talk about some of the tools that a lot of companies are using to implement Agile. And some of those tools may be helpful to you even as you're just working by yourself. So let's talk about team composition first. Most teams, they're about 4 to 6 people, is a usual software development team. They can go bigger than that. There are teams out there that have 12 people on them, but that's really the ideal numbers, 4 to 6. Anything beyond that, and you really end up breaking into more than one team, because you can't really put more than 6 people on one particular project. There's no project that's big enough to really handle that. Or rather, it's more efficient to break it into smaller projects. So generally the way that breaks out, you'll have one business analyst, which is going to be the person that's basically talking to the business and figuring out what the requirements are. What does the business actually want you to build? They're sort of a managerial role, not exactly, but their main goal is to figure out what you're building. Then in addition to that, usually you have 2 to 4 developers that are writing the software, as well as 1 to 2 quality analysts, which also you might know by the term of tester. They're people that are making sure that the software works and that it meets the requirements that have been established by the business. Okay. So other roles that you will interact with, people under the name of project manager. You also see product managers. Project managers are generally managing one specific initiative for the company where you're building this or that, versus the product is overseeing the entire application and planning what those initiatives will be. So usually the project manager reports to the product manager. You'll also see database administrators, also known as DBAs. They're your best friends when it comes to doing anything database oriented, whether it means making your queries faster or dealing with how data is stored on the server. They're a key touch point in a lot of those kind of things. They're, however, primarily focused with maintaining the live production site. They're not going to be so as involved in the development. So that's where you have to kind of get in touch with them and make sure that you're getting some input on what's happening in the live that can be made better, so that can be made better in the next release. So you'll see a lot with those, but generally these people are not on your team per se. The company may employ them, but they won't usually be part of your development team. Okay. You'll also see deployment engineers. Deployment engineers are the people who get your software released. Sometimes that's done by the dev team, but more often than not, somebody else manages that. So you may write the software, you may get it ready for release, make sure it's all tested, meets the requirements, hand it off to somebody else who actually has to push it live. That depends company by company, but just be aware that that's there. Okay. If you're working with a website, well, they'll be taking care of getting your code and the database changes up and live. If you're dealing with a desktop application, they may be the person that burns that initial CD-ROM that then can be duplicated and shipped out to your customers. So they do a lot of different functions. You'll also see graphic designers. Graphics are kind of an important part of software nowadays. So they're a very good person to interact with, and you'll usually be getting images and things from the designs. So do beware, some graphic designers do know how to write code, HTML, CSS, but they're usually dangerous. So usually take all of their code with a grain of salt and, clean it up once you've gotten it. There's also a new kind of role that's gotten onto the scene called a UX designer. UX is short for user experience, okay? They're kind of like a graphic designer, but not really. Where a graphic designer focuses really on how the website looks, and usually in sort of a static kind of looking. Their focus there. User experience is more focused on the usability and what can the user do on your website, making that clean. So a graphic designer usually comes from sort of an artistic sort of background. That may be theirs. A UX designer, actually most UX designers come from more of a psychology background, where they may meet with customers directly and kind of get some feedback from them as far as what in your software is hard. They're trying to see where are those places that your users are getting stuck. What might you do to make things better for them? So they're really focused on usability. So all of those people, it's a good chance that your company may have some of those people, maybe not have all of those people, but you will likely interact with them. Again, they won't probably be on your team, which means that these people are on a different schedule. So we'll talk about schedules a little bit when we talk about Scrum, but note that these guys are usually outside of your development team schedule. They're usually on a different development cycle. Okay. So one very important term that we need to talk as we get into Agile. We talk a lot about stakeholders, okay? So a stakeholder is anybody who has a stake. They care about your software. They have a direct, it directly influences them when your software is good or bad, or what features you have in it, or how usable it is. Okay, so anybody has a stake. And more specifically, they have a stake in quality or features. Okay, so this includes end users, customers, representatives, etc. That's usually what we talk about as your stakeholders. Okay, so let's say we're working with your blog application. Who are your stakeholders? Who has a stake?
People make a blog, like an ad.
Okay, so authors. And what else? Does anybody else care about your blog?
Probably whoever's writing the blog cares about it.
Okay, so I'm going to loop that in authors. So there's somebody who's writing it. Isn't there also somebody who's reading it? Mm-hmm. Right? So there's two different groups of people. So they're both stakeholders. Your authors are your stakeholders as well as your readers are your stakeholders. Right? They have an interest. Right? So what you do with the software you develop, in some sense, needs to pay attention to both of those needs. Right? What are the needs of the authors? What are the needs of the readers? Okay. What about the work orders application? Who are your stakeholders in there?
People taking the orders.
People taking the orders. Okay. Who else?
Customers having their car worked on.
Okay. Yep. What else? So there's people taking the orders. There's people doing the work. Those aren't not necessarily the same thing. The person at the front desk is not necessarily at the tech.
I was gonna say the technicians.
Okay.
Maybe even like not sales teams, but like analytics teams to see like
okay.
Because we have price tracking.
Yeah, they may have a stake on the back end to look at the data, right? They may want to look at trends, including marketing might want to look at trends. If you've been sending out marketing and you want to see who's been using your coupons or things like that. who's been responding to the ads you've been sending out. What else? There's one very important other user group that fits into there.
Louis.
Huh?
Louis,
Well, Louis. Well, what is Louis?
the CEO.
He's the CEO or the manager, right?
Yeah.
So the manager also has an interest in the software, right? And he's going to have different requirements than the other stakeholders do, right? So he's not taking orders. The manager's not taking orders. He's not doing the work. He's not getting work done on his car. He's somebody completely separate, right? So he's going to have different needs that are not necessarily going to be satisfied by what satisfies everybody else, right? So what are those, think about what are those needs that Louis might have, right? What are those needs that the manager might have that is different? Might he need to have some sort of way to look in and see what his technicians have worked on, how many hours they've been working? You know, he might want to look at it as on a per technician basis. Does that make sense? Right? Whereas like the analytics team, marketing, they care about it on a per customer basis, right? The manager cares about it from a per technician basis. Does that make sense? So they have a little bit of a different focus. And oftentimes that means that they need different features, or it means they need a entirely different dashboard or view of the software. Does that make sense? So those are the things we have to pay attention to. So the stakeholders, that's who we're building the software for, right? That's who we're building the software for. And what we want to do, ideally, is make them as happy as possible. Does that make sense? The happier we can make the stakeholders, the more we're doing our job. Our job is to satisfy the stakeholders. Okay? So stakeholders might include just a broad list of people. CEO, right, your Chief Executive Officer, your COO as well, Chief Operations Officer. So you got the executive up at the top, but you've also got operation, usually deals with day-to-day business, okay, and employees and such. Their CEO is usually mostly or around employees and product and all of those things. You also have your CFO. Your CFO is going to be really interested in that analytics kind of stuff and how much money you're making, right? Or
So
how much money you're
just
losing.
a very important accountant.
Yes. He's the head accountant. That's usually what a CFO is. He's really just the head accountant. So they're going to care about the software in a lot of ways. Okay. You also may have project managers, product managers, community managers. That's usually a title you see with games where they're managing the community and they might be looking at forums and feedback and interacting with community. DBAs, business area specialists, people that know the business and have some input there, as well as customers or representatives of the customers, because sometimes you can't actually get a customer in to tell you what they want. Sometimes you have to get somebody in to stand in their place. Okay. We also have end users and internal users, okay, fall into your stakeholders. So a few definitions here. So your customers are the people that are paying you money. That's the formal definition of customers. If they're paying you money, then you're a customer. If they're getting or using your software for free, they're not your customer. Does that make sense? So if they're getting your software for free, they are using your software, but they're not a customer as such. Okay. Whoever's your customer is specifically where the money's coming from. Okay. So there has to be monetary exchange there for it to be a customer. End users are anybody who's using your software. Does that make sense? So customers are people who are paying for it. End users are the people that are using it. Okay. At the end, once it gets shipped out, they have it and they use it on a day-to-day basis. Now, they're also generally not involved in development of the project. You know, they usually get it once it's all said and done. Internal users are people that work at the company that makes the software or makes the website. Does that make sense? So if we're talking about, again, about the work orders website, we're talking about car repair. Who are the internal users?
Like the text and stuff, or well, people taking the orders.
Are they? Because there's one important distinction there. They may or may not be, right? Your text may or may not be internal users. Question is, who wrote the application, right? So who wrote the application? So let's say they hired out a third-party or application, a third-party company to build this website. Okay, are the texts now internal users? No, they're not, because they're not internal to the company that built the website. Okay, if the automotive shop builds the website, the texts are then internal users. That make sense? Just strictly speaking, that's what it is. You can kind of, in some sense, those two cases, they're not that different, but strictly speaking, when we talk about internal users, it's the same company that built the software. So Microsoft employees using Microsoft products are internal employees. We are not internal employees of Microsoft, even though we use Microsoft products. Okay, so breaking it down for the different areas. So first of all, there's the business, and the business is primarily concerned with the financial outlook. They are most concerned with the product making money. Okay, so they care about your customers, your profits, how to get more customers, how to keep more customers, retention, and acquiring new customers and things like that. So that's where their world is, right? So if you talk to a business person, that's what they're going to tell you about, right? That's the biggest things that they can really speak into and say, if we do this, then we're going to make this much more money. So those people you're going to interact with, and that's the big part of the vision that you're going to get from them. Okay, they're not going to be able to tell. You don't want to really get from them that this button should be red or blue or green. They're not the right person to ask that question. They may want to tell you the answer to that, but they're usually not the right person for that. Does that make sense? So you just kind of to keep things straight about what the different functions are, right? More often than not, CEOs or people on this side will want to get in and tell you details about how everything should go, but recognize that these are not generally software people. Okay, but they're at the end. You pay your check, right? So we still have to find a way to make what they want happen. Okay, we've also got us, development code. You know, we're usually in the trenches, actually writing the code and developing the system, right? So that's what we call, and that's the development team. Okay. Main responsibilities: writing, maintaining the software, fixing bugs, troubleshooting issues. That does come up. You will find yourself sometimes troubleshooting issues even with front-end users. Okay. But you're not usually the first line of defense for support. Usually you're the last line of support. So if you're getting a tech support ticket, you know it's something important or something complicated. So titles that go in here, you'll see programmer, software developer, web developer, software engineer, lead developer. All of those titles kind of fall into those areas. And there's a lot of different areas there that we care about as far as what we work with. But our key metrics at the end of the day, what are we measuring? We're measuring performance. We're measuring how fast our system can work. We're measuring scalability, which is how big can I make this system grow? Can this scale up to 1 million users, and how well does it handle that? So that's where scalability is as we have more and more users, how does that function? And then we also look at fault tolerance. What happens when there is a bug or when there is a problem? You know, how do we handle that? You know, we don't want to take the entire system down. That's our job. That's part of our job. That's something that a lot of the other areas can't really speak to well. They're just going to assume, oh, the system's never going to crash. That's their assumption. So that's where our goal has to be, to make sure the system never crashes. Going back to the business and kind of looking at there, they'll talk about things like, what's the value to the business of writing the software, what's the cost of developing it, and then what are the costs of maintaining it. And this is one that usually people forget about. There's always, anytime you write software, there's a cost to build it, but there's always, always, always a cost to maintain it. And that's one thing you have to keep in mind. And a lot of developers forget about that cost, right? One of the biggest things that impacts that cost is really, when we're talking about relational database, the more tables we have, the more maintenance costs we're going to have. Okay, if I have a system that's built with 3 tables versus a system that's built with 30, I can tell you for sure that 30 table system is going to take a lot more work to maintain, right? Because I'm maintaining 30 different things or 30 different pieces of functionality, right? So usually I can bring the maintenance cost down a bit if I can have fewer tables, because means I'm maintaining less disparate functionality. Same thing goes with the number of classes you have. The more classes you have, the more maintenance you might have. That all depends. Big classes are also really hard to maintain, so there's somewhere in between. Okay. There's also quality or testing. So this is where the QA people come in. They're primarily concerned with the quality. Okay. They're concerned with how good is your program. So you may have written it, but how many bugs does it have? Or how severe are those bugs? You know, what are they preventing users from doing? Or if they occur, you know, what impact do they have? You know, do they mean, okay, well this happens and now the user's completely locked out of their account? Or this happens and the website's down, right? So they're looking at those kind of things, and mainly they're looking to see how well does the software that we've written line up with what the requirements are that the business has established. Does that make sense? So they're not necessarily, one key thing that people forget sometimes when you're looking at QA, they don't test performance. As a general rule of thumb, your QA people are not going to test your performance, they're not going to test your scalability. Okay? Because generally speaking, when we go test something, well, here's the script of do step, 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 and in that process, they're really focused on making sure I do this step and then this step and then this step, or it's something I can do predictively, which makes it really hard to then measure performance in there. It's also usually the case when they're testing things, we're working on a relatively small environment. So you might be working with, 10 or less users in your testing environment, probably with one server, right? And that's just not a good way to measure scalability when you talk about, hey, I want to blow this up to, I've got 100 different countries I want to serve and I've got 1 million users. You can't really test that with 10 users and get any sort of good feedback. So just recognize that's one part of quote unquote testing that usually falls more on the development team, more on our side than the quality team. Does that make sense? So metrics that you'll talk about, testability, verifiability. Testability meaning how easy is it to test it, or can it be tested at all? And verifiability is then, can I make sure that those answers are correct, right? If I type in a bunch of numbers and I get 3.6 out, well, how do I know that that number's right, right? So that's where verifiability comes in. It's a little bit different. Testability says, can I test it? Can I make sure it works? Versus can I make sure the numbers are right? Okay. care a lot about bugs, and again, fault tolerance is also somewhat in their shtick. Okay. There's also another group of people fall under deployment, operation. A newer kind of categorization there is DevOps, which DevOps is sort of a hybrid between development and operations. Typically, people in the DevOps space, they may write code, but they're generally writing that code for deploying servers or setting up environments, right? So they're usually working with more of the server side of skills, but they're writing code to automate those things. So that's one space that we see nowadays. So they're kind of a hybrid between a little bit of coder, a lot of server administrator. Okay. In there, you'll see deployment engineers, DBAs, system administrators, customer support, as well as tech support. All of those kind of people fit into this category. Does that make sense? So you'll have these people. This is where your first line of input. These are the people who, on the regular day-to-day, interact with your customers or your users. That make sense?
So, like project managers,
Mm-hmm.
are they ever writing code too, or are they usually just like an overview?
If you have a project manager ever writing code, you have a serious problem.
Okay.
You have a serious problem. So there's a few reasons for that. Project managers, if you've got a good project manager, they have a business degree. Okay. If you have a bad project manager, they have a computer science degree. The point of a project manager, their job is to interact with the business and figure out what you need to be done, but also but also to look at how are you progressing in what you're working on, and trying to make sure that you meet your deadlines. So project managers, really their main job is to make sure you meet your deadlines, and that the business is happy, and that the people on the team are happy. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
If they're writing code, they're not doing their job. Because that's not their job, and that shouldn't be their job. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And you also don't want them to be too technical there too, just because, like, okay, you have to understand a little bit because you're working with programmers, but if you know enough to write code, then maybe you can be dangerous there, because you tend to like, oh, I want to look at what's actually going on rather than. That make sense?
Yeah. Too much power.
Yeah. Because they should be key. They should be much more focused on the people than the code. And that's part of why we have this discussion, because there's a lot of those things that come up and people are like, what is this person's role,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's all these titles once you get into the business world, and it's like, okay, well, what's my job and what's their job? So we talked about deployment. They're going to talk also metrics they care about, and these are things you want to communicate to them, is downtime. They care about if the server is going to be offline. So if you have to go update the software, and that means that you're going to have to be offline for 4 hours, these people have to know. And they want to know sooner than possible, as soon as possible. So recognize if I go make a change to like the database schema, that affects these guys, right? Because I have to take the server offline for a period of time to make any changes to the database schema, as far as relational databases are concerned. Does that make sense? If I want to just add one column, I have to take the server offline for a period of time.
Are change control meetings a very common piece in the industry?
It all depends on what industry you're in. What is your experience? What do you define as a change control meeting? Because different companies define that a different way.
Okay. Once every 2 weeks, all representatives from each team would meet, and it was led by somebody who business guy. And at each meeting, you would tell what changes you would like to make to database 2 weeks in advance.
Yeah.
And then it'd be approved or denied based on conflict, whatever.
So, a lot of companies don't do those anymore. A lot of companies, companies that have been around a long time, that was a much more 80s, 90s. That was a necessary thing. You know, that has seen a definite decline. That companies stopped doing that as much. That being said, there is still some value to having those discussions, especially when what you're doing is going to affect another team.
Right.
You know, so there's still some value to meeting on a 2-week basis and things like that. The problem comes, and you know, and for sure you want to talk about those database changes things. The problem comes when some companies, when they set those up, you have the development team and people that understand the problem and understand what needs to change, and then the person that making the decision doesn't. They're kind of outside of that, right? So they're in the operations world. They're maybe your DBA. They're making that decision, and they're biased towards never making any change, right? Mm-hmm. Usually that's who, unfortunately, has the say when it comes to those kind of things. So that's, the problem is there, when you have those kind of breaks, is if they can deny it, they're basically always going to deny it. Because it means less work for them.
Right.
They're strongly motivated to deny those changes and say, just find a better way to do it. And for some systems, what that's meant is, well, I can't change the schema, so we'll add another table. I can't add a column, so we'll add another table. Or things like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oftentimes it's easier to get by them. We want to add one more table instead of when we want to change or rename or remove a column. You know, those are really hard things to persuade.
Okay.
So they have some value, but the problem is who at the end of the day is making that decision. And if the person making that decision is strongly influenced, is really in the operation space, they're not really all that constructive. That makes sense? Or can be. It really depends on who's there. So if you have the person that's making the decision that's more from the business side, remember, what's the business goal? They want to make the customers happy, and they want to make this. They want to make money. So they're going to take the route that accomplishes those goals. So if there's a feature that we really, really want, and that feature requires a change to the database, they're all for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So those meetings they're helpful if the end users, the stakeholders, have a say in determining whether something gets changed or not. But they're not helpful if operations has the say.
Okay.
That make sense?
Yeah.
It's not something we can change, unfortunately, but just realize that is the world. People have their own biases, and for the most part, especially in operations, they're already really busy people. So they're usually working pretty hard. So anything that they can do to not do more work, they'll usually sign for that. So they care about anytime there's going to be downtime. They care about what's the continuity of the system. That can mean a lot of things, like, for instance, if you're doing a major upgrade, let's say you're going from Bootstrap 3 to Bootstrap 4, you know, there's a lot of things that broke, right? So those would be kind of in there. They care about, you know, how is this going to work from version to version? You know, what features am I going to lose? Are features going to move around? They care about a lot of those things because they're going to have to communicate those things to the customers, right? They have the job of, you just added a new feature or made a major rework. They have to now tell the users how to use the new system, and they're going to get the support calls for all that. So they're people you want to keep happy because they're ideally keeping your customers happy. And they also care about any time you might lose data, because again, that directly affects your users, right? So that's how things break down into the different areas. Okay. Can you see maybe how when you're writing software you want to keep all of those people in mind? Right? Everybody's got a different perspective. They're going to approach it at different ways. When you're asking them for requirements, asking them for how to make the software better, everybody's going to give you a different answer, right? So you really have to talk to everybody. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's go take a quick break and come back at 1:30.
What kind of Ajax features are you looking for?
That's one of those things I want to check off with everybody on a basis.
Oh, okay.
The key point is it needs to be something that noticeably improves
User experience.
user experience over not using Ajax. Does that make sense?
I mean, I added a chat feature. I don't know if that. I don't know.
Well, ideally, you shouldn't have to add any features when you get out.
Okay. Well, I'll have to look into it more then. 'Cause I don't know what else. Because I mean, I have post requests all over the place for my code.
Okay.
Like my pop-up buttons. I'm just deleting stuff as Ajax.
Okay.
I mean, if that's.
That's enough.
Oh, okay.
Those things would be enough. Again, I need to look at specifically where you're using it.
Right.
And we can come to an agreement on that. But if it's being used to delete things, that's fine. That's one way to use it, and that does improve things because you're using dialog boxes and refreshes.
Mm-hmm.
If you're using it well, again, the important part of Ajax is you can use it, but you have to use it well.
Okay.
Because you can use it nearly anywhere, but the question is that a good use of it?
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah.
That's what I'm looking for.
And I'm going to go ahead and assume that the progress bars on the spreadsheet and photo uploads are not going to count towards the 2 features.
No, they would. They would, because it improves user experience.
So inherently, I, in theory, wouldn't have to add anything.
Probably not.
Why?
You may already have it counted.
Progress bars are required then, weren't they already?
Right, that's what I'm saying. So now it's.
So that would start counting. I'm not going to count all the progress. Like, I would still count the progress bars in one thing.
Right, okay. So.
Like, if you have 3 different progress bars, I'm not going to count that as both of your things.
Right.
But if you're having Ajax progress bars, well, that is demonstrating that you know how to do Ajax, and it's demonstrating value and understanding of that because, well, if you don't have Ajax there, the page just sits.
Right, with that, yeah.
For a few minutes and then it refreshes.
Yeah.
So that has a big influence, and that's a very good place to use Ajax.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because otherwise you can't have a progress bar.
Okay. Yeah.
So that counts.
Cool.
So, no, you don't need to add a delete functionality just to satisfy Ajax. Sorry, a chat function.
I mean, I already added it. It's kind of cool, but screw it. I mean, yeah.
That's what I'm looking for is things like that, progress bars and using dialogues to confirm. That's it.
Okay.
question? This is just a little bit too much, but this is sort of, we've overheard a little bit, I overheard a little bit about what you were talking about, jobs and things. So I was talking to a friend of mine who owns a little company, he does a lot of marketing and stuff, and I told him I was doing it, I was like, I'm learning all this coding and ranking, it's really fun. He's like, well, are you planning to move to India? Because I always outsource my developers. It's like I always, so I just thought I would run that question by and see what you say about that.
I say that there are some talented Indians. I've worked with a lot of Indians here, actually. I've worked with people that were outsourced to other countries. Actually, they actually were living in Europe.
Yeah.
So, I've not worked with somebody who's I've worked with people who are outsourced to America and people who are outsourced to Europe, but I haven't actually worked with any. I've worked with Indian developers, but I'm working with Indian developers working in India. That whole idea of outsourcing was a very, very popular movement, late 90s, early 2000s. A lot of companies went that way. A lot of companies are pulling back from that, actually. There's still some of that happening. I would say, though, you know, if I'm building a development team, partly be a developer, I'm gonna more than likely hire somebody that speaks English, because that's actually really, really important, as it turns out. It's really, really important to speak good English. So, you know, somebody overseas speaks, you know, they're living in India and they speak really good English and they do good work, great. But more often than not, what's happened is, especially what happened in early 2000s, was so these were contracting companies, right? They basically had a group of, 20, 100 employees somewhere in there. They just get something from across the ocean and say, hey, here, work on it. And then it's like trying to even say do vacation with them as they're going. So.
Okay, so you're saying it's not, I was making sure, like I was telling him, I was like, they're telling me there's plenty of jobs here in America. It's like an exploding market and stuff. And so I should be able to find a pretty good job if I can succeed, if I can do well at this. Okay.
It's not as easy as people think, and especially people who are outside of the really space and understand everything that goes into it.
Yeah.
You know, if you're just looking at the dollar bills.
Yeah.
And you're just looking at cost per hour, it seems like a great deal.
Yeah.
When you add up all the costs that really go into it, it's not cut and dry. You should just, you know, send it off to China or send it off to.
Okay. So it's sort of like, it was a trend maybe a decade ago.
It was a trend.
Or a couple of decades ago.
There
but
are
now
still
it's kind of trending
companies.
back a little bit.
Yeah, there's still companies working that way. And really, what happened was, is there's a wage discrepancy where a developer here, say working in Missouri, might cost you $30 to $40 an hour. You might get the same developer over in India for $10 an hour. Thing is, it's not the same developer.
And
As
the
it turns out.
communication problems, it takes a lot of time.
Communications problem takes a lot of
Hours.
time, and you have to recognize that there's a change in time zone.
Yeah.
So even just to be able to communicate with them at all, you have to go through the language problems, as well as all the language difficulties, as well as you're going to be up to early hours of the night or morning, even to talk with them.
Yeah.
And that's just on a video call. And video call quality is still crappy across the ocean. So, you know, you can fire up a Skype call, but having a crappy Skype call and not all that sick.
Plus with the language, plus with the time, which is awful. It's not,
Yeah.
it's not as,
So, you know.
it's not a good user interface.
Yeah. So that's all the stuff that, you know, companies are starting to realize. And, you know, so a lot of companies did that, and then they realized how much extra costs went into that, where the actual cost per hour was less. You ended up paying people here to manage it and deal with all those things, as well as
dealing with some prospective employees in the site. Because, again, some of them are having to deal with all these things, as well as just, it's one thing if they do the same work in the same number of hours, but if you say $30 versus 10, and it takes them 3 times as long to do it,
Yeah. So then it's not
you've saved
cost-
nothing.
Right. And a
In
lot
fact,
of aggravation.
you've missed your deadline
Yeah.
by a factor of 3,
Wow.
right? So there's a lot of factors in there,
Yeah.
so.
Oh, that's good. That warms my heart.
Yeah.
I'm in the field and I can make a good. All I care about is making a good,
You
decent.
can totally,
Yeah.
you can totally make it happen. There are ways to work with people overseas, but it's not so cut and dry that you just send your work over there and it'll be,
Really done for a third of the cost. Right.
yeah, third of the cost.
All right. Well, thank you.
It's, if you're lucky, you'll break even. You're better off, the most productive teams are co-located. It's just a fact of life, unfortunately.
What is co-located?
Co-located. They're all in the same place.
Oh, the same building. That we can just run upstairs and not do it.
Or, well, just
Or I am.
more than likely they're just on the other side of your cubicle wall.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
Right? They speak English on the other side of the cubicle wall, you guys get stuff done.
Yeah.
And you go out to the bar after work. Those people get more done than the 2 people that are, the team of people that are all across the globe and speak different languages.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. I feel so much better.
Yeah.
Struck terror in my vitamins today.
Yeah, no, there's more to it than that.
Awesome. That's great.
You want software on time, done well and done on time, and when you start taking those factors in, it's not a simple formula.
Yeah. I got just hearing a little bit from here. There's like lots of moving parts.
Right.
I don't know how much more context to be for that one.
You should buy like a 10-point pack of lozenges. We'll be good to go.
All right. So we talked a bit about the different business areas, the different functions, and how we interact with that. We talked a little bit about how teams are made up. Does anybody offhand can tell me what I said the normal team size is?
4 to 6.
4 to 6 people, right? Of those 4 to 6 people, how does that break out normally?
You got a business analyst.
A business analyst, which what do
2
the
to 4 developers.
okay
And 1 or 2 QAs.
QAs? Okay, so what does that business analyst do? They work with the business, and what do they do? What's their key job function? And why do we need one on our team?
To make sure we're meeting any business needs in the program.
Okay, right. So they're how do you document your business needs?
SRS.
Okay, that's part of it. We also which SRS stands for
Software requirement specification.
So requirements is the important word in there, right? So your BA is really about requirements. They're gathering the requirements. They're gathering the work items that need to be done. That makes sense? They're figuring out the requirements from the stakeholders as far as what needs to be done. So, software development life cycle, okay? So every project that you ever build, you ever will build or ever have built has a life cycle, okay? At some point, it's birthed, you created it, it came into being or it was designed, and then at some point, it died, or it will die. It's just an inevitable part of software. At some point, your software will go out of use. You know, we dream and hope that our software will be used for the next 20 years, but if we look back 20 years, what operating system were we primarily using? Windows 98 and DOS and yeah, or sorry, Windows 3.1 was in there too. So if you compare what our software looked like, our operating systems and our hardware looked like 20 years ago,
Sure.
no software that was written 20 years isn't really in life today.
I mean, Linux probably was used back then.
Yes, that's one of those exceptions.
I think
Linux
NASA uses
and things like that.
Windows 98.
Something. I don't know so much about that front.
I think a lot of computers.
But the point is, recognize there's a limit, right? If you wrote us a program 20 years ago and didn't change anything, didn't change a single line of code between now 20 years later, is that program going to run at all on Windows 10? Or is it even going to run on current versions of Linux? No, not really even. So you see that across the board. If you're going to keep a software alive, because hardware is changing, because operating systems are changing, and because all the other libraries and things that you're working with, like jQuery and Bootstrap, all of those things are changing. You know, your browsers are changing, CSS is changing, JavaScript is changing, HTML is changing. If there's not a team developing it, it's going to die. That makes sense? If there's not a team putting more work into it. So that's one thing to keep in mind, okay? But the birth maybe is the more important thing to talk about. So how does a project start? Well, ideally it starts from the business. The business starts with, I need this thing. I need this to make my life better. Or I need this to reach more customers. So it's generally going to start from the business. It might start when the company launches. It might start 20 year. It might be this business might be 20 years old when they start this business. It might be a restaurant that's been out there for 20 years and family owned, but they don't have a website yet. Right? So at some point you're going to start that project, you're going to create that new feature, and in that point there's usually a lot of documentation and design and discussions with the business that have to happen to make sure that you figure out what that project is, right? At least at some preliminary level, okay? So there's a beginning to that life cycle, and there's generally an end. The SDLC covers primarily what happens during that alive portion, the portion that's in between, but it also does cover that birth pretty heavily. So there are parts of what we call the SDLC that will cover the alive, will cover the in between. Okay, and those are usually two different sort of processes, although they might be all in the same document. Okay, so in that process, there's a lot of documentation that's usually required. There's a lot of sign-offs that are required, where maybe you created this design or this SRS, and somebody has to say, yes, it's okay, or somebody has to review it and you make corrections and all those kind of things. So all of that comes into this formalized SDLC. Most companies, pretty much every company that is writing software will have an SDLC. Unless you're working for a contract on a contract by contract basis and just making a website for mom and pop or for Jimmy or whoever it may be. If you're just making a website for them, it's a one-off. They probably won't have this process. But if you're working with a team of people, there's going to be a formalized way of doing things. Okay, so company will usually have decided on that and have written it out in a pretty formal way. Okay. And usually that's one of the first things that you're going to learn when you start at a company, is have to read about that SDLC. You were talking about reading, what, 80 documents, something like that? SLC was probably one of them, right? Somewhere in there. I know I've had to read through that at both companies, both the previous companies I work at. We had a formalized way of doing things. So we got documentation, what documents are required to do this, when does it due, who has to sign off on it, what things do you have to create designs for, whether it be like UML diagrams or ERD diagrams or screen mockups or whatever else they may require, as well as potentially building some prototypes. Prototype being like, hey, we built this kind of quick and fast just to see if it's going to work, but it's not a finished sort of project. So prototypes are in there, demonstrations, meetings, other ways of interacting with people, or deliverables. Deliverable would be anything you're creating a file, whether it be a Word document or Excel document or a program. So a deliverable is anything that's a set of files that you're giving to somebody. So, we want to talk about, in SLC, we want to go back and talk about something called Waterfall. So Waterfall model is kind of one way to build software. And it breaks down into a series of phases. Each of those phases has to be done completely before you can start the next phase. It just goes straight from this phase to that phase to that phase. You keep going forward in the process. But these things have to happen before these things can happen, before these things can happen, and before these things can happen. And you generally don't work your way back. But if you do, you fall all the way back and start everything over. Okay. And then every stage, every one of these phases along the way, somebody has to sign off on it. Somebody has to say, you're done, and I'm the right person to sign off on that. I give my signature. One thing to know as far as this waterfall model goes, this is something that's a bit of a straw man as we're going through this. Nobody writes software like this, nor have they ever written software like this. At least they didn't before the paper about this was published, and then some people wrote the software this way. But this is not the way that we want to do software, and we'll talk about why that is. But this will get us kind of an intro to what's out there and how our other different tools function. Okay, so the common waterfall paradigm looks a little bit like this. You can have more stages than this or fewer stages, but this is kind of a generally accepted way of grouping things. So the first thing you do up at the top is you create the requirements. Okay? You have a meeting with all the business people, just the business people, let me be clear about that. The only people that usually get involved in the requirements or allowed to get involved in the requirement stage are business. So they decide what we're going to build. Decide all the requirements, make this big, elaborate 100-page SRS document, and then at the end somebody signs off, probably the CEO, and says, yes, this is good, go get started on writing it. And they may have spent a month, 3 months just working on that one document. Okay? Next thing that happens, we go into the design, where we start handing this off to graphic designers and maybe a few development managers, maybe some project managers, maybe some product managers. We hand it off to maybe a lead developer even, maybe if you're lucky. But this is still in a very small number of people's hands. That make sense? What we're trying to do is build a design and figure out what we're going to build and everything that goes into it and how we're going to build it. So we're building out the architecture. The end result, though, of this design process is still not software. Okay? Once we finish design, all we have is a requirements document and a design document. And think of this as a big Word document. You've got 2 big Word documents after we finish this. A few months into the software, into building the program, and we have 2 giant Word documents. Sounds great, right? Maybe 200 pages between the both of them, have been written. Okay. Now that we finished all that, we know exactly what we're going to build, down to the finest detail. Nothing could possibly go wrong, right? Nothing could possibly go wrong. Okay. Now, if something does go wrong with the design, we go all the way back up to the requirements and ask for new requirements, and start this process over again. Okay. So once we've got these fancy documents here, the design document, the requirements document, we're going to go off to the implementation stage. That's where we actually get the developers involved. And now we tell them, this is what you're going to build. And this is probably the first time they've heard about the project, in fact. They likely haven't been involved in those previous 2 stages. So you hand them this document, That being said, well, maybe 2 or 3 of your developers, like your software architect and your lead programmer, might have been involved in these meetings, and hopefully they got a chance to give some input. But you start going and building this. Okay. That's where us as developers, we get involved then. Okay, so let's say this took 3 months to do the requirements of design. How long do you think implementation is going to take? Any guesses? How would you do ballpark that to say, we spent 3 months designing it, how long do you think it'll take us to build?
It depends.
I think it.
What unit would you measure it in? Do we measure this in hours, in days, in months? Realistically, you measure it in years, right? This takes 3 months. That takes 2 to 5 years. Okay. In the meantime, so you've had the design document for, let's just say, just 2 years. Okay. What's the likelihood that the business has changed after 2 years? Changed what they do or what their needs are? It's very high. It's basically guaranteed. After 2 years, they'll be doing something different that's really important to you. What about your software? Do you think that you'll be still running on the same version of the software that you started with? Is that going to be the latest thing? So let's say we have Visual Studio 2019 right now. Okay, well then those 2 years, Microsoft's released 2, not just little releases. They've released 2010 and 2011 or whatever, 2020 and 2021, right? So Microsoft's completely changed Visual Studio, and there's probably been at least 1 or 2 major releases in whatever whatever platform you're working on. So even if you're working with Node or Ruby, doesn't matter, right? If I've gone 2 years, the technology's probably changed from everything I'm working with.
Frameworks,
Entity Framework's got a new version. Your database server has a new version. Hopefully in there you haven't decided to switch database servers, God forbid. Although that happened, that could happen. So you start this with 3 months here, then you shoo the business people away, and then you work on coding it for 2 to 5 years. In the meantime, every few months your business people are saying, why isn't it done yet? Why isn't it done yet? Why isn't it done yet? It only took us 3 months to design it. Why aren't you done yet? Right? That's how this works. And believe it or not, there are companies that have done that. One of the companies that I worked historically, that was part of their process. A new version of software was every 1 to 2 years. that we push out a new version.
How do like contracting companies work if this is the process?
Not
Yeah.
Not very well, because this is historically how we've done. When we were just talking about outsourcing, historically this is the process that we've taken for outsourcing. Is we spent this time and then we hand it off to another company, and there's plenty of horror stories of like, hey, we handed this off and it's been 5 years and it's not done. And in the meantime, the business hasn't really had maybe very much input on that implementation stage. Okay? But we recognize we're not done, right? So let's say we get to the end of the 2 years and we've built as much as we think that we get as close as we can to it. Maybe we 90% done, but the business is tired of waiting for us to build the last 10%. So we got to get it out to the field. So then we go to integration and testing. In this process, this 2 years, we haven't done any testing. We haven't got QA involved. All the testing's been done by developers. And some developers are better than others at testing. But if you work on a project for 2 to 3 years without testing, how many bugs do you think, big bugs are there going to be when you go down to this stage? There's going to be a lot. They're going to be really important, and they're going to take a long time to finish. So you do this for 2 to 5 years, then you go into integration and testing, and maybe that takes you 9 months to fix all the bugs that you created over 2 years. Maybe. All depends. But that's a big hurdle there. But at that point, this is the first time that your testers have seen it. Once you signed off this and said it was okay, this is the first time that your testers have seen it. Because they didn't need to know about it when it was an unfinished project. Why would they need to test a project that's not finished? So they do that. So we do our testing. We also do in there what's called integration testing. Integration testing is where you combine your code that you've written with other code, with other systems. So let's say you're building this big fancy feature that does blah blah blah. Well, you interact that with the rest of the application. Now that code gets merged and combined with the rest of the application. Okay. And in that process, you have to test that other thing, you didn't break something else while you were working on the thing you were supposed to be working on. Okay. And that's where we talked about change control management. Well, that's where that happens now. Is you say, okay, now I've got the changes ready to go. Here's what they are. I hope you're okay with that, because otherwise we're going to have to go back to implementation.
Unless you're Bethesda, in which case you just skip that step.
Oh, I'm sure they still do some of this. I know that people rack on them for not doing much, but they still do something. It's just that they have a long cycle time, so you only catch so much. So you fix it, you try to fix all the bugs you can, find them and fix them before your users do, and then you get to deployment. Deployment's that process of, okay, we've got it ready to go, let's get it out to our customers. So we've got 3 months, 2 years, 2 to 5 years, maybe about 3 to 9 months, probably closer to 9 months. And then we've got this deployment process, which probably takes under a month, hopefully, to get it from we've got finished to live. Depends on how complicated your system is. And then you've got this maintenance phase. Well, maintenance is we've finished the entire project, it's out in our customers' hands. This is where operations now gets it. And that's where your tech support now has it, and they have to deal with problems that your users have. Okay. And again, you can kind of see the arrows going back. If anything goes wrong, just go back to the start. Get some sign-offs, because you're probably going to need to change the requirements. So does that make sense? Okay. You see the whole idea, part of the idea of the structure is you're separating so that there's only part of the company is working on the software at any given time, right? So that's business primarily, and then you get into the development team, also the development plus QA, and then the deployment group that probably involves developers, and then maintenance primarily involves operations. So you're separating it on business areas.
So is the QA always testing stuff? The stuff, or are they doing other stuff too?
So typical QA role, they'll be doing testing, but also writing tests, and they usually have a pretty big interaction with the BA. Because again, the BA is gathering requirements, so you're kind of writing tests around those requirements. So in fact, most QAs interact more with the BA than the developers. There should be some interaction with both, because that is what is, but just because of separation of concerns, making sure that priorities are respected, and different things. We don't want your tester to be biased necessarily by the developer, because then you don't necessarily get great testing, although you still need to have some interaction there. But yeah, primarily writing tests and running them is usually what most QA do. Those may be automated tests, or they may be paper, physical documents of do step A, B, C, D. There's a mix of both in QA. Okay, so going through, we kind of talked about all these, so I'm going to skim through this real quick. Requirements gathering and analysis, that's the first one. We gather requirements. System design, we take the requirements and kind of boil those down and come up with a design document, and that defines what the entire application is going to look like. What are those classes that go into it? What are the tables? Yada yada. Everything except like writing code. You don't typically write any code at this point, but you'll design all the classes. So all the UML, you might define them. Okay. Implementation, that's where we write the code. Yep, so we may build different parts of the system as smaller units. Integration and testing is where we do the big important testing. Deployment, get it out to customers. Maintenance, there we start to address issues as they happen in the field. And that's where you also see things like patches. Patches get released in the maintenance stage. Okay, so the waterfall paradigm, waterfall model, is very much follows the kind of structure. It's a lot like a waterfall. It just goes down, right? Cascades from one thing to the next thing to the next thing to the next thing. It's pretty linear, right? At least that's the ideal. In reality, if you were to implement this, it's not linear at all, but it looks like it's linear. But it also means there's a lot, because of that, there also means there's a lot of bottlenecks or people not doing anything. So if you follow that to the letter, QA is only working for this period of time, this tiny slice of time, or your business is only working for 3 months out of 5 years. So why are you hiring them? Why are you employing them? Similar thing, So that really doesn't happen. That it's ever strictly divided as that, but this is one way to kind of think about it. And where this comes from, historically, this kind of model comes from manufacturing and construction. If you think about building a house, right? You come up with the design and the permits and everything at the house at the beginning. You build the house, you get it past inspection, and then somebody lives in it. And that works, right, for the most part. Sometimes there's changes that happen along the way where, somebody says, whether it be a building inspector or whatnot, says you have to do this and such, or your person that you're building a house for might change what they want. They might want an addition along the process, but it kind of works. Does that make sense? Same thing with you're building a car. It's in theory, it's pretty from beginning to end. But it's also usually a bit more compressed, right? You probably don't spend 5 years building one car, right? if you're going to say this is the 2011 Ford Focus, it better release in 2011, right? So more than likely, if you're designing a car or something like that, this process probably is going to be a year or less. Does that make sense? So it's going to be a lot more compressed than what usually happens with software. So this idea of the so it works under these kind of circumstances. So it assumes that you have a highly structured environment, and changes along the way are very expensive, so you want to figure them out ahead of time, right? Changes in software are not always that expensive, right? It's usually pretty easy to change things in the middle of the way. But if I figure out the foundation's wrong late in the process, that's a problem, right? I can't just, if I have to go change something about the foundation, I have to demolish the house and start over. So that's where this comes from. And originally it was kind of first adopted when there wasn't a recognized way to do this. So one of the earliest articles about this was written in 1970. Winston W. Royce wrote this in 1970 and actually presented this as a non-working model. He says, this doesn't work, and here's why. He said, here's a way to go follow construction and manufacturing, and you could do this, but it won't work, and this is why. Unfortunately, a lot of people took it, and some people took it, companies took this and said, oh, well, this is great. We don't have any other options, so we'll just go do this waterfall thing. So waterfall works as long as all these conditions are satisfied, okay? So let's go through this. So waterfall works as long as you know all the requirements ahead of time, they're well documented, there's no ambiguity, and they can't change. Okay, so that's condition number one. Are there any software applications that fit, are there any software projects that fit that requirement number one? You know all the all the requirements at the beginning, there's no ambiguous wording, and you know they're not going to change.
Yeah, no.
Not really. I mean, there might be a few it might work if you're writing a printer driver, you know, maybe.
I mean, like in a construction project, steel is always going to be steel.
Exactly. Steel isn't going to change, and it's very unlikely that we'll get something better than steel in the process of you building that house or building that car.
Yeah.
And even if there is, you're not going to use it for that project. That will be next project. It doesn't so much work with software. So things are constantly, so you have to have documents that are well documented requirements. The product definition and objectives are stable. In other words, what this application needs to do is well defined and won't change. We know what we're doing for our customers, and we're not going to change that. Okay? We also have to have really good understanding of the technology, and that technology has to not be dynamic or not changing, right? So we talked about building houses. Will laws of physics change? No, not really. So if I know that these forces and these stresses, you know, they're not, the house is going to be able to stay standing, that's not going to change 2 years from now, right? That doesn't exist in the world of software, really. I can say, this is great, this will work today. In 2 years, it might not. I don't know. Because I don't know what's going to change. And our technology's constantly evolving, they're constantly changing. You look at just the difference between Bootstrap 3 and Bootstrap 4, and you see how big that some of those changes can be.
And then Bootstrap 5, we're getting rid of jQuery.
What? Okay.
Remember?
I haven't heard that story yet.
When we were working on Learn to Earn, looked at what was upcoming for Bootstrap 5.
Oh, okay. I don't remember that. Interesting. Yeah. So, as you can see, so these are the requirements that have to be in place for Waterfall to work. And then you really have to have, one of the things in here that people lose to is you have to have the technology you're working has to be well understood. Specifically well understood by the team. Essen, Brandon? So the technology has to be understood very well by the team, okay? That actually isn't even usually satisfied. Because technology changes as fast as it does, and because you're very likely to be working wherever job you land, you might be working on this ASP.NET stuff. There's a good chance you won't. And there's a good chance in 5 years that even if you start an ASP.NET, you'll be working on something else. So a lot of software is written by people who don't understand the technology stack that they're writing that software on. A lot of software is written as people are learning how to use said software. Just because by the nature of change, by the time that you're an expert on something, the industry's already moved on. Does that make sense? So that's one thing that really you have to keep in mind as you're building long-term projects, is that you're going to be working, some of the people on your team, including you, won't necessarily know the technology thoroughly. Also, the other expectation for Waterfall, ample resources with required expertise are available to sort the product in each phase. Okay, let's walk through that. Ample resources. Usually that means people, but that may also mean training. The proper training, the proper people are available, and they have the required knowledge or are involved. And they're able to be there at that. Well, people take vacations, people leave the company, people join the company. Sometimes you don't get the right person for the job, sometimes different things happen. So more often than not, unfortunately, where you might be able to say, okay, I need to find, well, this needs to pass the building code inspection. Well, there's a contact number locally for somebody who is the inspector. You call them in, they do the inspection, but they say it goes, right? They're the expert. You can find the expert. Or you can find the person who wants the house built for them, right? They're the person paying the builders to build the house. You find them, okay, they're available. You can find an expert developer for building houses, expert developer for building architecture. It's very hard to find and have everybody represented in the process. Does that make sense? There's a lot of things that get in the way. So, for instance, a lot of times, it's really hard to get engaged with your customer. It's really hard to get in touch with what your customer is. In fact, sometimes you don't even know who they're going to be. So figuring out who they are and what their needs are is difficult, right? Because they don't always know what they want. And then also the expectation down at the bottom, Waterfall works under the assumption that the project is short, right? If I take this model, if I take the Waterfall module and apply to it a 3-month project, it applies a lot better than a 5-year project. Does that make sense? It's a lot easier to build a 3-month project than a 5-year project this way, because a lot of those problems along the way don't become as pronounced, right? The longer project is, the more these problems deficiencies become pronounced. So in reality, you look at all these requirements and say, if we had all these things, which we have if we're usually have if we're building a house or building a car, then Waterfall is great. But none of them exist in software. Pretty much every software project that you work on will break all of those rules. So let's not do that. Okay, so this is where, now that you've kind of got the introduction to what waterfall is, let's talk about how we actually build software. At least how we build good software. Okay. So a key principle in writing good software is that we need to write it piece by piece, or iteratively. Okay, we build this, and then we build that, and then we build this, and we build this, and in that process, we build something simple, we make it more complicated, we add more things to it, and that process generally continues. So we start with as simple as we can, minimum viable product, as I mentioned earlier, and then you start adding things to it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Along that way, that gives us a lot of opportunities to get user input and to test that things work and deliver value to the customers directly and get something that will make your business owners happy. So that's a very important thing, is building software iteratively. Okay, iterative development is kind of fundamental to the Agile philosophy. Okay, iterative's been around pretty much as long as we've been building software, some way, shape, or form. But it's only recently that we've started to formalize these things. Okay, so they've been around 1950s. You go back in history, you can see earliest examples of iterative development go all the way back to 1950s. We didn't actually start formalizing it until the 1990s, about agreeing with here's standard things and tools that everybody can use to build software. Okay, and see that took some time. Okay. So we started to formulate these in the 90s, and what came out of that is something called Agile Methods. Okay. So in 2001, a small group of developers got together. These are primarily working as contractors and such, and with a variety of companies. But they got together and published what's called the Agile Manifesto. Okay. And this really came out of frustration with all the current methods and thinking about, and them really thinking about how can we make the industry better? How can we make this, how can we make better software for our customers, better software for our users, and make our employees happy? Because following things like waterfall structure doesn't lead to happy employees. You end up with unhappy business owners, you end up with unhappy customers because they're not getting what they want, and they end up with really buggy software. And you have employees that are overworked and they don't have any input on the creative process. They're kind of left out as far as the developers are concerned. You've got QA that has to do everything in a very constrained process. You know, they're on a high time crunch because by the time that QA gets it, you're already late. So, Agile Manifesto. So I'm going to read this off and we can talk about it. So we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan, and that is to say, while there is value to the things on the right, where we still value them, they're not as valuable as the things on the left. Okay, so rather than really focusing on strictly following an SDLC, strictly following all these sign-offs and using tools that guarantee that, like, hey, this person signed it off and all these criteria, all these checklists have been met, we really want to focus on the people involved and talking to them and having interactions with them and getting their input and getting their feedback rather than making sure we're following a process. Because just following a process does not lead to good software. Good software comes out of working with people. Okay, and we also want to, at the end of the day, we want to get working software, right? we don't really, these 200 pages of documentation that we had at the beginning, from the requirements and the design process, that's just documentation, right? It doesn't do anything for our customers at the end of the day. It doesn't earn us any money. In fact, by the time that we finish this process, that 200 pages of documentation is probably so wrong, you might as well just burn it, right? By the time that you're 2 to 5 years down the road, whatever you wrote there at the beginning, it doesn't matter. It doesn't reflect what the system looks like today. So rather than spending 3 months writing that document, let's focus on and making sure that that document is right and hoping that that will save us. Let's focus on making software that works. That make sense? We're not going to completely throw away all that documentation, but we're going to write a lot less of it. So the amount of documentation that we write nowadays, what might go into an SRS, is going to be a lot smaller than it might have been in the 90s. That makes sense? Because we're starting to move into this agile world. Okay? We also say that we really value working with our customer collaboration. We really value working with our customer and getting their buy-in over making sure that we negotiate a contract, right, that neither of us can weasel out of. Does that make sense? When we're dealing with this, you write down these formal legal contracts about what you're going to build and how you're going to build it and yada yada and how much it's going to cost. And there is some value to having a well-defined contract, but it's much better to work with your customer along the way to make sure you're delivering what they need. Does that make sense? You'd rather work with their customer than make sure that we have an airtight contract. Okay, and adapt to their needs. We're also going to say that we really, especially if it's going to take us time to build the application, we need to be ready to respond to change. And rather than saying strictly at the beginning, we're going to find this plan, in 3 months we're going to find the plan for what's going to happen in the next 5 years, and then we strictly have to follow that, it's not going to work. So we'll say, we'll make a plan. We'll make that 5-year plan, but instead of strictly saying we're going to do this because we planned it, we're going to do it because we're going to do things along the way. We're going to make changes because we need to. Does that make sense? So these are the kind of the core parses of what makes Agile different from Waterfall. Okay? So it means that we're really focused on that customer, really focused on making sure that they're happy and not focused so much on the paper and the process. So as one person kind of expanded, you can kind of read through this, worth paying attention to. I'm going to kind of skip over it for the interest of time, but there's some more expansion on what those different bullets are. Okay. Here's an interesting quote from the Agile Alliance. The Agile movement is not anti-methodology. In fact, many of us want to restore the credibility to the word methodology. Okay. We want to restore a balance. We embrace modeling, but not in order to file some diagram away in a dusty corporate repository. And we embrace documentation, but not the hundreds and hundreds of pages of never maintained and rarely used tomes that end up just in a file cabinet somewhere. We plan, but recognize the limits of planning in a very turbulent environment. We do need to plan, but we know things are going to change, so there's only so far that plan can take us. So those would brand Agile practitioners or proponents of XP or Scrum or any other of the other Agile and this is his words, you know, as hackers, really don't know what that term means, if that makes sense. So there's been some pushback. You know, there's been different things there. But Agile's definitely taking over as far as the software industry is concerned. I would say both of the two previous companies that I joined, I think prior to, you know, and originally when I got on those company, actually neither of them were practicing Scrum or Agile, and both of them did. So there's still, it's surprising that they're still kind of adapting. Where you land, it may be that they are already doing Agile, it may be that they're not doing it yet. But it's really, given the benefits that we're kind of talking about, it's really something that kind of benefits every company. It doesn't matter what you're doing to go that direction. So, over the years, we've discovered a lot of different ways to do Agile and a lot of different tools that can make that work. Okay, there's a lot of different practices out there. Every company really has their own flavor. The way that every company does Agile is completely different. There's not, if you look really close at what this company does versus that company does, you'll find that there's a lot of changes, and part of that actually comes from Agile. Part of Agile is making changes to the process as you find out that you have problems. So that's where a lot of different companies will end up with their own special flavor. Now, what I do want to go over is a few of the tools that are more widely used. Okay. So Scrum is one of those ones that's used pretty much across the board. If you're doing any form of Agile, you're probably doing some version of Scrum. Whether or not you're doing formalized Scrum, you're probably doing, there's a good chance that you'll be doing some version of Scrum. Okay? Now, Scrum revolves around something called a sprint. Okay? Scrum comes kind of what you call it, rugby kind of terminology, but it revolves around what we call a sprint. A sprint is kind of variable in length. Different companies define it different ways, but usually it's about a week or two. 1 week or 2 weeks. So the sprint is this, what we call time boxed. We put a box and say it's going to be exactly this amount of time. And in that process, we're going to work on building software. Okay? So at the beginning of that sprint, we're going to have a sprint planning meeting where we're going to plan the software that we're going to build. And at the end of that sprint, we're going to review the software or demonstrate it to our stakeholders and get their feedback. We'll also do a retrospective at the end of the sprint to see if there's anything in the processes that we're using that can be improved, right? Would it be better if we did this or did that? And that's where the team talks about those kind of things. Okay? So again, a sprint's kind of time boxed. Okay? You'll see there's a few other things in here. So there's a product backlog. That's the things, the features, or the work items that the business wants done. Usually we try to prioritize this as much as we can from like highest priority to lowest. And then you also have in here the sprint backlog. Those are the items that we've decided that we're going to work on in this sprint. Make sense? So this is all the items that we want ever. This is pie in the sky. And this is what we're actually going to work on in this week or two period. Make sense? So at the beginning of the sprint planning meeting, we'll bring in the business and we'll bring in the developers and as many people as we can, all of those different business areas, all the different stakeholders, and decide on what's going to be built in that sprint. So we'll put that in the sprint backlog, and then over that 1 week or 2 week period, we're going to work on backlog. We're going to work on that sprint backlog. Okay? So terms in there, We've got the product backlog. That's the long list of work items that stakeholders want built, worked on. In the case of a 5-year project, that's everything they want for the next 5 years is all in that one big backlog. That backlog can easily have a few 100 items in it. Okay. Then we've got the sprint. Again, usually it's 1 week, 2 weeks, but it really depends on the company. And it really depends on the team. It's not unusual that one team at a company might have one sprint length and another team might have a different length of sprint. Okay. And we got the sprint backlog, which is what we've picked to work on. The sprint planning meeting happens generally should always happen the first day of the sprint. And that's where you decide what you're going to work on. Okay. It's where you get the Scrum team together with the stakeholders and you decide on what you're going to do. You plan it out. So we're kind of doing planning out like you saw at Waterfall, but we're doing it every 2 weeks. That makes sense? We've got 2 week sprints. We're doing it every 2 weeks. Planning out what we're doing. So we're getting things down to a smaller iteration cycle. Right? We're iterating every 2 weeks. The sprint review happens at the end of the sprint. So at the end of the sprint, we show the customers, here's what we built, and we say, what do you think? Sorry, we show our stakeholders what we built, and they say, okay, what do you think? Give us feedback. How can we make this better? You know, have we met your needs? And how can we meet those needs better? You know, and that gives them an opportunity to see the software at every 2 weeks, right? Rather than waiting 2 years and then hoping they like what we want, what we built, we show it to them every 2 weeks, so that they have constant chances to give us feedback on, and for us to change things as need be. It also means that if we royally screw something up and we completely misunderstand what they said, how much work have we wasted? Well, we wasted 2 weeks, right? So worst case scenario, we wasted the sprint going in the wrong direction, rather than potentially spending a year going in the wrong direction, right? So that's a lot easier to recover from, especially since as you go through, the more changes you make without changing direction, the harder it becomes to go back. Okay, so the important part though with that review is we have to get feedback. We have to get feedback from the stakeholders. If we don't get feedback, that meeting is useless. Okay, similar thing, if the planning doesn't result in planning, it gets distracted and working on something else, then it's not a useful meeting. That makes sense? So it's important to keep these 2 meetings on track, because that keeps your entire process on track. If those get off track, then you start losing all the benefits. Okay. We also have the sprint retrospective that's generally going to happen at the end of the sprint, and it generally happens either before, after the review, usually after the review. In that process, we shoo all the business people out. And that's kind of important. So when you have the retrospective, you don't want to have your stakeholders in. You absolutely do not want to have your stakeholders in the room, and you generally should not have anybody in the room who has any impact on somebody's salary. You do not want your boss in that room. Because what needs to happen in this retrospective is you decide and you talk about what is causing us pain. As a team, what is causing us pain? You know, and what would make it better? You know, what is getting in our way? What can we change to make us work better together and to get more software, get more and better software built, you know, get more done in the sprint or whatever it may be. So you're talking about things, and this is probably one of the most argumentative meetings that you can have.
Like what you can improve on for the next.
Yeah, what can you improve on? Which is why you want to get managers out of there, you know, and not stakeholders, because this has to be from a technical side. You know, This can't be from the customer's point of perspective. From their point of perspective, that's what these meetings are for. These meetings are for the customer. This meeting is for the people working at the company and making their lives better. You know, and if you're going to do things like, you know, other things that happen there, if you want to say, maybe there's a new technology coming out there or something on the horizon, this is a good place to talk about that. You know, if you've got, okay, well, when are we going from Visual Studio 2019 to 2020? Well, this is a good time to talk about it because you're working with your peers. So this is a very limited. You only want a small number of people in there, and you really generally, let's say your company has 5 teams, well, you shouldn't have 5 retrospectives. You shouldn't have a retrospective generally with more than 1 team in the room, because that needs to be, everybody in the room needs to get a chance to speak, and everybody in the room needs to get a chance to be heard and get a chance to talk about what are those things that we could do better, what are those things that went poorly, you know, and what are those things that went well occasionally. So that's where that fits in the process. Okay, so you're gonna have the review and the retrospective, you're gonna have the planning. Okay, so those are your big meetings. For sure, though, yes, you want to shoo the stakeholders and such out of this room, but don't forget to take notes, right? This meeting, this retrospective, only has meaning as long as you take notes and take action on what comes out of it, right? If you don't take action out of it, why are you having the meeting? No offense.
Ego booster.
Yeah. This meeting has to have, change has to happen from that meeting or things don't work.
Right.
Okay. Another important meeting in there, so those are at the beginning, at the end of the sprint. Along the way, we have a daily scrum. Happens every day, usually in the morning. Okay. You could potentially do it later in the day, in the afternoon or the evening, but it really needs to happen preferably first thing in the day, because it's really preparing you for the rest of the day. Okay. So in that, everybody on the Scrum team is going to come into one room, and they're going to go around, and everybody's going to answer a very short list of questions. Okay. Question number 1: what did you work on yesterday? Okay. Question number 2: what are you working on today? And then third question: what obstacles are getting in your way? That's it. You finish that up, you pass on to the next person. And this meeting needs to be kept brief. It's vital that daily scrum is brief, but it's also vital to have it, right? It's vital to have it on a daily basis, because what happens in this scrum is you're trying to sync up on what is everybody doing and making sure that nobody's stuck and they can't work. That makes sense? And also finding those places where I'm working on this and you're working on this, we need to work together because otherwise there's going to be problems. Does that make sense? That's part of what comes out of this, is knowing who's working where, or knowing, oh, you just made a change to this yesterday, well that's going to affect what I'm doing today, you know. So the idea is to go around and do that really quick, dismiss the meeting, and then conversations can happen that are between, you know, one-on-one on the people that need to do need more details there. As a general rule of thumb, you will probably have a regular one-on-one with somebody in the team. It's very unlikely that you'll be just done after answer all those questions.
Is it the project manager who usually leads Scrum, or does it really matter?
It doesn't necessarily matter. It can be really, the Scrum Master, as they say, can really be anybody. And they don't need to be certified per se. There's a Scrum certification. You don't need to do that. It'd be Scrum Master. So Scrum Master just is it's like Master of Ceremonies. You're just making sure that we are having the meeting every day, and everybody gets a chance to do their part, and everybody's kind of following the process. That's it. So it can be a developer, it could be a QA, it could be the BA, it could be the project manager. I think it works best if it's not the project manager, to be blunt. But that happens a lot of times because they're in the managerial role.
Right.
And that's usually seen as sort of a managerial role, even though Scrum Master is not really managerial. It's just process. Everybody in everybody in the Scrum should be standing. We call it a stand-up meeting for good reason. And the reason we do that is that it keeps the meeting short. Because we want it to be short. We don't want this to be a long, drawn-out meeting. We emphasize this should not be a long, drawn-out meeting. Ideally 15 minutes or less for the entire meeting. Okay. Which if you map that out, 15 minutes for 5 people, that's 3 minutes apiece. Okay, that's actually already a lot. So the idea with the stand-up is that people can only stand up for so long. So eventually people's legs are going to get tired and they won't be able to stand and everybody will want to adjourn. So by standing up, you encourage that meeting to not delve into a 2-hour, 3-hour discussion of yada yada, which can happen. Does that make sense? That's why that's recommended. And then, again, any further discussion should happen after we've adjourned. Any questions on that daily Scrum? So that's the overall kind of picture of Scrum. Scrum creates a very regular rhythm of meeting with stakeholders, because we're meeting them at the beginning and end of every sprint, and getting that feedback. Getting feedback on what's important to you today, what do you not like about what we are doing so far, right? And how can we be better? Okay. And this really this helps us build software that's really built around the best interests of our customer. You also make sure that when we've got discrepancies, where we've got disagreements or misunderstandings, where I think when you said I wanted this, you actually wanted something else, that means that we find out those things out a lot quicker instead of waiting longer in the process. Okay, as well as just what the expectations are. Okay. And part of that comes down to, more often than not, your business people may be speaking a different language than you are as a developer. And that can create misunderstandings. Not language as in like English versus Spanish, but language in terms of you're speaking developer code speak and they're speaking business speak. And what might mean one thing to them means something else to you. So as long as the sprint is, if the sprint's respected, the stakeholder is prevented from making change in the middle. It's one of the things you have to watch out for. You don't want your stakeholders making changes to the sprint backlog. Once you've decided what you're going to do for that sprint, it's fixed. They can't change it until the sprint's over. As long as that's done, then what this results in is it gives space for the developers to do that work. Because it takes some concentration to write software, and it takes some focus, and it takes some kind of understanding of the direction that you're going in, and to continue going in that. So it's important that stakeholders can't make changes during that 2 weeks. They can make changes to the product backlog all the time. They can do that continuously. But the sprint backlog, you cannot make changes, you can't add things during the sprint. Okay? Because as soon as they do that, that creates a lot of stress and it removes a lot of the benefits. You lose a lot of those kind of benefits to the developers of having I know what I'm building on for the next week. It's like, okay, I understand you want changes. Tell me in a week. Come back. But for now, I'm going to build this. Now, that's not to say that you don't interact with customers along the way or don't interact with them and try to kind of nail down what specifically they want, but you don't want to have 1 week into this, in 1 week into a 2-week sprint. Here's a new item to work on, and it's going to take you 2 weeks to finish. Because you've now just lost all your planning. So that's one thing that you really have to watch out for, and I've seen a lot of teams, a lot of stress over that issue, and that's really something that comes to whoever's being Scrum Master or whatever, and this is why one of the reasons not to have your project manager be your Scrum Master, because they'll always say yes to those things. Hand it to a developer more than likely to be Scrum Master, because they're going to say, no, I'll come back to you in a week.
What are like sprint points?
Huh?
Like sprint points, like what's the point and like why?
Okay.
It's like 1 to 10.
Let me
It's like
come
it's
back
like
to
Fibonacci
that.
scale.
So it comes to, what you're talking about is estimation. Estimating how big something is. Okay. There's a bunch of different ways to do that. We usually call them story points, actually.
Story, yeah. that's
So
right.
you've got story points, you've got t-shirt sizes, you've got hours. Those are kind of the big categories of how to do things. So you might say t-shirt sizes, you say this is a large, a small, a medium, an extra large, an extra large, and you just kind of categorize things in buckets. That's not a bad way to do things. The other way is, story points, you kind of, it's an arbitrary number. You say it's this big. How much work is it going to take to finish it? And usually we use the Fibonacci numbers for that. So like 1, 2, 3, 5, yada yada, 8, 13. So we use those numbers to kind of bucket it. And the idea is that you set 1 as being your smallest or your simplest thing. And story points are a very, very relative measurement. One team might measure an item as 5 story points, and the other might measure it as 20. That's okay.
Why isn't it just measured 1 to 10?
Because when you're building software, things are not. It's very hard to tell this thing like a 2 versus a 3 versus a 4 versus a 5, and at that point the value between those things isn't really important. That makes sense? So there's a level of granularity when you're estimating software that doesn't matter. There's there's no way you can possibly be that accurate. The difference between saying that this is going to take me 5 hours versus taking 6 hours, I can say that I'm probably wrong, right? In fact, the general joke or the general rule of thumb is take whatever your estimate is and multiply it by time and a half, and that's probably what's really going to be. If you think this is going to take you 6 hours, it's probably going to take you 9.
So is the idea that story points the thing because like we think about I want my each sprint to be worth 8 points.
Right. So when we're planning the sprint, we might say this team, their what we call the velocity or how much they're going to do in that sprint is like 20 story points or 80 story points or whatever it may be. So the general thing we do is we'll kind of estimate how big those are in the backlog, and then we'll say, okay, so we'll take 20 story points of stuff to do this sprint, because we think that's roughly how much we can get done. Okay. There's different feelings on whether or not that should be by story points or by hours or by t-shirt sizes. They all can work. I think I'm more nowadays on the side of do it by hours, estimate it by hours instead of by story points. And part of that is just that a lot of the tools that are out there work better when you do that than when you do story points. One very important thing to keep in mind is as you're doing Scrum, trust is really, really important. And trust is something that everybody is responsible to, from the CEO down to QA or developer. Everybody is involved in that, forming that trust. And the trust goes both ways. The stakeholders need to have enough trust in the team that they can leave it alone as they're working on the sprint. They need to trust them to be able to work on the software and come out with something good, or to take their feedback and use it at the end of the sprint. Make sense? They need to trust them to do their work without being tightly supervised. Okay? It's also important, trust goes the other way, in that the team really depends on the feedback and the work that goes into the backlog from the side of the stakeholders. Okay? If they're not building and putting items into the backlog ahead of time, ready for the sprint planning, that makes things really hard, right? If you don't have an item at the beginning of the sprint planning that's good fleshed out, it's really hard to then build a successful software if they don't do that. That makes sense? If you get an item that's like, here, build this, and it's got 2 sentences in there, which I've seen on multiple occasions, it's really hard to then go do that and build what they want if that's all you're given, right? So there's some trust on the team that the stakeholders that are going to go do that outside of the sprint time, outside of the sprint planning meeting. They're going to have that ready for the sprint planning meeting. It also really depends on getting that constructive feedback from them at the sprint review, right? If they look at your software that you built and you said, oh, that looks good, and that's all they ever tell you, oh, that's great, thank you, that doesn't make for a very successful team. Does that make sense? You have to get some feedback. We need feedback from the stakeholders in the review meeting. Okay. So we have to do whatever we have to do from that, whether it makes sure we're asking them questions or making sure that they have time to do that, and whatever tools we need to do, we've got to have that, right? So if we can't trust them to do that, things start breaking down. So, we're at 2:44. I'm going to take a 15-minute break here, and then we've got a few videos that I want to kind of watch through. That's kind of one of those things, and when you talk about the input process, so when you talk about from the customer's point of view, that is super hard. Yeah. But at the same time, they'll underestimate how much work goes into it, because an import, very little on the front end you actually see, but there's so much that happens on the back end. So you might have, it's probably going to be the shortest thing you write from the front end, but it's going to be the longest set of functions that you ever write on the back end. Just because there's so much that has to do. So, and a lot of that's just like, hey, you're a software developer, and you get to learn how to put all your tools to use, and build this and build it efficiently and deal with all the problems that you know.
plan for the amount of time that you need to get it done, because it's gonna take longer to get done than you think it is.
Hi, this is me. My name is Hamid Chojai, and I've been involved with a number of software development projects over the years at a number of different companies, and I've come to recognize Scrum as one of the best agile development practices in use today. In this fast-paced video, I want to show you why Scrum is so great and how you can get started with Scrum in under 10 minutes. I'll cover all the core Scrum concepts, like product backlogs, team roles, sprints, burndown charts, and more. So get ready to be bombarded with information.
So one part of why we're talking about this stuff now is the plan is I do want to kind of have a daily scrum with you guys for the rest of the semester. We'll probably do that in groups of 4 on a daily basis, but just kind of to get you familiar with the process and to keep up to pace with where you guys are at with the final project. You can kind of think of the demonstration at the end. Part of why we're doing that demonstration is because of that's something we do as far as the review meeting, right? So getting some practice for something you're probably going to be doing on a very regular basis is a good thing, right? Getting used to demonstrating software because you're going to be doing that on a regular basis. If not every review meeting, every other, more than likely. So.
Let's say this is the product we want to build.
So this will tell us a little bit more, some other things, different view of how Scrum works. He'll give another summary of that, and we'll go and talk about the next thing. So he does talk about more about, you asked about estimation. There's some more of that in here.
Hi, this is me. My name is Hamid Chojai, and I've been involved with a number of software development projects over the years at a number of different companies, and I've come to recognize Scrum as one of the best agile development practices in use today. In this fast-paced video, I want to show you why Scrum is so great and how you can get started with Scrum in under 10 minutes. I'll cover all the core Scrum concepts like product backlogs, team roles, sprints, burndown charts, and more. So get ready to be bombarded with information. Let's say this is the product we want to build. For this product, we get all kinds of feature requests from customers, executives, or even other team members. In Scrum, features are written from the perspective of the end user. Therefore, features are known as user stories. The collection of all these user stories is called the product backlog. Another way to think of the product backlog is to think of it as a wish list of all the things that would make this product great. Once we have our wish list or the product backlog, we need to start planning which specific user stories we're going to be putting into a particular release of our product. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's back up a bit. To build this product, we need to have one or more people in our team who are going to play a variety of roles. First, we need her. She plays the role of product owner and helps make sure the right features make it into the product backlog, representing the users and customers of the product. She helps set the direction of the product. Then we need this guy. He's the Scrum Master, and his job is to make sure the project is progressing smoothly and that every member of the team has the tools they need to get their job done. He sets up meetings, monitors the work being done, and facilitates release planning. He's a lot like a project manager, but that's such a boring title, so we'll call him a Scrum Master to imply he knows some jujitsu. And the rest of the team has similar roles to other development processes. These guys build the product, while these guys test it to make sure it works right. These guys use it and hopefully pay for it. And these guys, they generally get in the way, but it turns out you can't build many products without them. But let's get back to this, release planning. To plan a release, the team starts with this, the product backlog, and they identify the user stories they want to put into this release. These user stories then become part of the release backlog. The team then prioritizes the user stories and estimates the amount of work involved for each item. Sometimes larger user stories are broken down into smaller, more manageable chunks. The collection of all the estimates provides a rough idea of the total amount of work involved to complete the entire release. A quick side note about estimates. There are a lot of techniques for creating good estimates. Some prefer estimating in story points, where estimates are made relative to building a small component with a known level of difficulty. Unfortunately, story points don't answer the question of, when will my project ship? I've found that the best technique is to estimate work in hours, but to use some standards in how estimates are done. For example, things that take less than a day to complete will be estimated as 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, or 8 hours. Every item will fall into one of those buckets. There will be no 3-hour estimates, for example. A 3-hour item would fall into the 4-hour bucket. Larger items will be estimated as 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, or 10 days. Again, all estimates in between will fall into the next larger bucket. Extremely large items are similarly estimated in months, 1, 2, 3, or 6 months. But the reality is that such items will need to be broken down substantially before work actually begins. We'll come back to these estimates in just a minute. But for now, let's get back to this, the release backlog. With a prioritized set of user stories and the estimated amount of work at hand, we're now ready to plan out several sprints to get the work done. Sprints are short duration milestones that allow teams to tackle a manageable chunk of the project and get it to a ship-ready state. Sprints generally range from a couple of days to as much as 30 days in length, depending on the product's release cycles. The shorter the release cycles, the shorter each sprint should be. And you'll want to have at least 2 to as many as a dozen sprints in a given release. So at this point, we can take our release backlog and split it up into several of these sprint backlogs. One of the most important things to remember about sprints is that the goal of each sprint is to get a subset of the release backlog to a ship-ready state. So at the end of each sprint, you should have a fully tested product with all the features of the sprint 100% complete. Since sprints are a very short but a realistic representation of part of the product, a late finish of the sprint is a great indicator that the project is not on schedule and something needs to be done. Therefore, it's extremely important to monitor the progress of each sprint with this, a burndown chart. The Burndown Chart is the #1 reason for Scrum's popularity and one of the best project visibility tools to ensure a project is progressing smoothly. The Burndown Chart provides a day-by-day measure of the amount of work that remains in a given sprint or release. In this graph, you can see that the amount of work remaining bounces up and down from day to day, but is generally trending towards 0. Because historical information is provided in the Burndown Chart, it's easy to see if the team is on the right track. Using the Burndown Chart, the team can quickly calculate this, the slope of the graph, which is also called the burndown velocity. This is the average rate of productivity for each day. For example, a team's rate of productivity might be that on a typical day they finish approximately 50 hours of work. Knowing that, it's possible to calculate an estimated completion date for the sprint, or even for the entire release based on the amount of work remaining. What's great about the Burndown Chart is that we can compare our actual velocity and projected completion date to what the team needs to do in order to finish on time. This is perhaps the most useful piece of knowledge that any team member, product owner, or product executive can have about the project. Because knowing whether or not the project is on track early in the schedule can help teams make the proper adjustments necessary to get the project on track. The Burndown Chart provides empirical proof that the project is on track or if it's going to be late. So let's talk a little about where the data for this incredibly useful Burndown Chart comes from. As you recall, part of the release planning process was to create an estimate for each user story in the release backlog. The collection of these estimates for a given sprint represents the total amount of work that must be done to complete that sprint. As each team member goes through and makes progress on one or more of the user stories, they simply update the amount of time remaining for each of their own items. So the total amount of time remaining on the group of user stories that make up a sprint changes on a day-by-day basis, hopefully going downward until it hits 0 when the sprint is complete. The Burndown Chart aggregates the remaining work data and shows it visually. It's brilliant because it communicates a massive amount of information in just a few seconds. And that brings us to this, the Daily Scrum. The Daily Scrum is an essential tool to having communication flow freely between team members. The idea is to have fast-paced, stand-up meetings where team members quickly list the work they have completed since the last meeting and any obstacles in their way. By meeting daily, it ensures the team is always in sync and any major issues are dealt with as soon as they are known. Finally, as each sprint comes to a finish, it's important to have a sprint retrospective meeting where the team can reflect on what went right and areas of improvement. After all, Scrum is a flexible, agile development method that needs constant improving and tweaking for every team. So there you have it, Scrum in under 10 minutes. You now know all the essential concepts to start implementing Scrum inside of your organization. But wait a second, what about tools to help you implement Scrum? Well, it just so happens that I've spent the last 10 years building such a tool, with a lot of help from these guys, a group of genius coders and design ninjas. The tool is called On Time, and it helps you manage your products, your backlogs, your team, your releases, and your sprints. It gives you project visibility with burndown charts and always answers the question of who is working on what. You can get started with it for free at Axosoft.com. Of course, you could use a giant whiteboard, some note cards, and a bunch of different spreadsheets to track everything. You could also use an abacus instead of a calculator to do math, but we're getting a little off topic. So let's quickly review everything. In Scrum, you work with this, a product backlog, which is nothing more than a list of features that we call user stories. You then break down the product backlog into one or more release backlogs. And for a given release, you further break up the release backlog into a number of sprint backlogs, which are essentially short duration milestones throughout your project. You then monitor the progress of each sprint using these, burndown charts, and have daily Scrum meetings to ensure everything is on track. After each sprint, you have a retrospective meeting to fine-tune everything. And if you want a tool to implement Scrum, you can use On Time. That'll help you ship software on time. That's all there is to it. Oh, and one last thing. Whether you loved or hated this video, I'd love to hear.
So that's one tool. That's not the tool that I would
Hear from you.
recommend. The tool I'd actually recommend working with is Trello, which hopefully you can get a demo in today or tomorrow. But it's a lot easier to use than that.
What about Jira? Is that?
So Jira is a bug tracker. It's basically, it can track work items in general, so it can do some of this stuff, but it's primarily just to track bugs in your system and to see when they're finished. You know, bugs that have been found by QA or whoever, and track what state they're in. That's the main use of Jira. There is another video there if you want more information, but I'm going to skip over this one. So, how do we track this whole thing? So there's another kind of process that's very similar to Scrum. It's called Kanban. Again, it kind of started in the manufacturing industry, actually. I think it started with Toyota, if I remember right. This is what we want to kind of show you, and this is what Trello does. Trello gives you what we call a Kanban board to manage things. So he's going to go through and talk about some of this stuff. I think, yeah, so we'll go look at this. I think, if I remember right, yeah, he's with Atlassian, which is the same company that actually builds Jira, by the way.
Kanban is a work management system designed to help you visualize your work, limit work in progress, and maximize efficiency, which we call flow. Kanban is the Japanese word for visual signal. With so many of us working in services and technology, oftentimes our work is invisible or intangible. Kanban helps you visualize your work so you can understand it better, show it to others, and keep everyone on the same page. Most teams realize this benefit by building a Kanban board, filling it with Kanban cards, and setting up a work in progress limit. I'm Max. I'm a product marketing manager on Jira software, and I'm naturally kind of a chaotic person. I seem to always find myself in fast-paced environments. I've been on really dysfunctional teams, and in the past been in dysfunctional organizations. The number of times that I've seen Kanban kind of bring method to the madness, to change the culture of the organization, and just help me get work done, has me basically shouting from the rooftops about Kanban. So I actually have a lot to say, and I've broken this conversation up into a series of videos all here on our YouTube channel. So the first thing that I would ask is that you subscribe to the channel so you can hear this whole conversation play out. I want to show you something. One of my favorite things about Kanban is that Kanban starts with what you do now. This is actually one of the Kanban principles. Another being that Kanban respects current roles and responsibilities exactly the way that they are today. You simply apply the Kanban methodology to how you currently work. Another Kanban principle is that Kanban encourages acts of leadership from all levels. It's on the team to work together to make Kanban work for you. Now, if those principles are something you can get excited about, then you might want to start by making a Kanban board. So this is what I wanted to show you. It's a Kanban board that I built to visualize all the concepts we're covering in this video series. I just finished talking about the Kanban principles. And it's important that I started on the right side of the board here. Kanban is a pull system, which means when you have bandwidth, you look to the left and pull cards from left to right. Since I have bandwidth now, I'm ready to start my discussion of Kanban boards. Kanban boards like this one can be built on walls, windows, whiteboards, or with a suite of digital tools like Trello and Jira. Their purpose is to categorize all the stages of work that a work item flows through from something you haven't started to something that's done. This is called a workflow. You'll notice that each stage in the workflow has its own column, and our workflow is super simple. Your workflow might be more complex, but I'd encourage you to start as simple as possible. You can always add more columns later. So for now, I'm done with this quick explanation of Kanban boards. I'm going to take this card from something I'm doing into something that's done. Since I have bandwidth again, I'm ready to move a card from today into doing. Let's kick off our discussion of Kanban cards. For the Agile software developers among us, cards should be a familiar concept. You can think of them as one Kanban card per user story. For the rest of us, we can just back up. You can think of Kanban cards as being work items. One card per work item. You want to make cards for all the things you're working on and place them in the appropriate stage of the workflow. Kanban cards should have a title and a description and an owner. You can also add any other helpful information like a due date. Then your card should start to gain a little bit of a history as your team leaves updates on the card as it moves from one stage of the workflow to the other. Kanban cards should be small enough that your team can make progress on them in a reasonable amount of time. You don't want them so large that it'll take you weeks to move the card forward, and you don't want them so small that it's literally every task that you're working on. Can you imagine how chaotic your board would be if it was every task your team was working on? You want to avoid that. Once you build a board and you fill it with cards, you'll start to realize one of the key benefits of Kanban. You'll see columns that start to bunch up, revealing a bottleneck in your workflow. You'll also get a sense of what size cards your team can move forward in a timely manner. These efficiencies we like to call flow, and Kanban is built to help teams flow work better from the backlog to done. Once you understand flow, you can start to measure it. Kanban teams concern themselves with lead time, which is the time that it takes for a card to flow through your workflow from when you start working on it to when you're done. It's in the hands of the customer. And with that, I feel done with my conversations about lead time, and thanks to this board that I built, I actually know that I'm done. I have visual assurance that I've done all the things that I set out to do in this video. It's a good feeling.
So Kanban and Scrum, they have a lot in common. In fact, what you usually see in the wild is something of a mishmash of both. So you're usually going to see a little bit of Scrum and a little bit of Kanban and kind of borrowing techniques from both sides is what the current trend is towards. So a few of these there's a few more videos here that kind of are going to delve deeper into what's a Kanban board, what's a card, because that needs a little bit more explanation before we get in and actually use them.
A Kanban board is a project management tool designed to help you visualize your work using cards, columns, and specific commitment and delivery points to help you understand how your work flows so you can get your work done. I'm Max, a PMM on Jira software, and I manage all of my projects with the Kanban board. In fact, this video series is managed on a Kanban board. In a lot of ways, if you're watching this video on the internet right now, Kanban boards work. We're going to start our discussion talking about the elements of a Kanban board. Basically what you should have on your board to make sure it helps you manage your work. Now, there are two philosophies about this. The first is by David Anderson, who popularized the Kanban Method. The Kanban Method is largely responsible for taking Kanban from a manufacturing process into software. And David Anderson defines 5 key elements of a Kanban board. One of the first things you'll notice about a Kanban board are the visual signals, cards, stickies, tickets, or otherwise. Kanban teams write all of their work items onto cards, usually one item per card. For Agile software teams, you can think of these as one user story per card. Cards help teammates or stakeholders get a glance at what everyone is working on at one time. Another hallmark of the Kanban board are the columns. Columns represent a specific activity that together compose a workflow. Cards flow through the workflow until completion. Workflows can be as simple as to do, in progress, and done, or much more complex. 2 important components of a workflow are the commitment point and the delivery point. Kanban teams often have a backlog for their board, where customers and teammates put ideas for new projects that the team can pick up. The commitment point is the moment when a team picks up one of those projects and work begins. The delivery point is the end of a Kanban team's workflow, For most teams, this is when the product or service is in the hands of the customer or done. The time that it takes to get from the commitment point to the delivery point is called lead time. Lastly, WIP limits. WIP, or work in progress limits, are simple mechanisms to limit the number of cards in any one column at any one time. Kanban teams find that by limiting work in progress, they actually move projects through the board in a more timely manner. Those 5 components, as described by David Anderson, are more than enough to manage the flow of work with a Kanban board. There's another philosophy, however, that's much simpler. Let's walk. This second philosophy is Personal Kanban by Jim Benson and Tony Ann DiMaria. In Personal Kanban, there are only 2 rules: visualize your work and limit work in progress. And you can do this however you see fit. Personal Kanban is great for boards that maybe only you contribute to, or a small team with a simple workflow. The simplest Kanban boards are physical boards where teams divide their workflow into vertical columns. They take a whiteboard or a blackboard and they mark up the board, filling each column with sticky notes. The sticky notes then flow through the workflow to demonstrate progress. The first advantage of a physical board is it's super easy to set up. The second reason that I love physical boards is they're so tangible and fun. Kanban helps you visualize your work, and there's something about this colored sticky note and moving it from one column to the other that is so motivating and easy to engage with. If you're starting to visualize your work, you might as well start with a physical board. Digital boards are preferable for a whole host of reasons. The first is that if your team is remote or distributed or just not all in the same building, then you really want to have a digital board. You want everyone to have equal access to the information and be able to access it from anywhere. Second is that digital boards are just plain fast. If you've ever used Jira or Trello, you know that you can create boards and columns and cards in seconds. Lastly, digital boards like Jira come complete with all the data and information you need to make informed decisions about how your team is working. While it's not impossible with physical boards, being able to analyze WIP, cumulative flow diagrams, cycle time, and many more with just a click or 2 is a huge advantage over physical boards. Those are the key things you want to look for in a digital board. We've included a link in the description for a tutorial of how to make your first board in Jira software. My mentor, Zach Neese, gave me great advice for how teams should get started with Kanban boards. He shared that teams should start with a physical board built on a whiteboard or a window with Sharpies and pens and sticky notes. This physical board is going to be a great conversation starter. People will walk up to the board and look at it and start these conversations about how you work, about how you write these cards, about how you move work through these columns. These early conversations are going to lead to some changes in your workflow, and those changes are essential to getting Kanban right. Once you understand how your work flows, you're ready to graduate to a digital tool like Trello or Jira. These tools are going to help you measure your progress, and you'll be able to share your workflow with people outside of your immediate location. And when you're ready to do that, we can help. So what do an American supermarket, the Toyota manufacturing process, and the humble sticky note have in common? They were all important steps in the development of Kanban cards as we know them today. Kanban cards are visual and sometimes physical cards that help a team understand the status of a work item, the history of a work item, and what it takes to get that work item done. I'm Max. I'm a product marketing manager on Jira software, and I have shipped 641 Kanban cards since I started working at Atlassian. Basically, every large work item I've ever touched has had a card made for it. And I know that I ship about 1.05 Kanban cards a day. Because I'm so consistent and because I have this data, I can use this for planning. This is the benefit I want to help you achieve through today's conversation about Kanban cards. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm in the supermarket, I'm not exactly having life-changing discoveries. Most times, I can't even remember why I'm there. But I'm not much like Tachi Ono, who's the father of the Toyota manufacturing system. So Tachi Ono was walking the halls at an American supermarket, and he noticed that employees would only stock shelves that they saw were depleted. When there was extra space on the shelf, they would stock new inventory. This is largely called a demand-driven system, something that he hadn't seen before. Tachi Ono took this observation back to Toyota, where he used it to create a demand-driven system. Imagine a colored index card in the bottom of a bucket of bolts. As the bolts would start to be used, the index card would start to reveal itself. When it was fully revealed, it was time to order new bolts. These Kanban cards formed the basis of the Toyota manufacturing system and informed how we use them today in Kanban work management. Uses of these cards rapidly evolved into this artifact that would follow a work item through the factory through different stages of completion. This story and this notion of an artifact following your work through stages of completion is what influences how we deal with Kanban cards today. Here are some components of a Kanban card for maybe a software development team. You'll want things like a title, a brief description, you'll want an owner, maybe some useful information like a label, a due date, an SLA, or maybe how much time has been logged on the issue. And lastly, at a glance, you want to know what stage in the workflow is this card in. This information is not static. It's not something you set and forget. As a card moves through the workflow, the story grows and changes over time. By the time a card is done, it'll have all of the updates from all of the workflow stages, any blockers it's run into, and any other useful context or information. So how and when do you create these Kanban cards? A lot of Kanban teams are service teams, like IT or help desks. They choose Kanban for the ability to continuously start new work and continuously deliver work. These teams oftentimes have service desk software, something like Jira Service Desk, where their customers, both internally or externally, can create tickets for the team based on their needs. Those tickets are automatically turned into Kanban cards that the team can pull into their workflow when they're ready. Other teams, like software development teams, will make cards themselves in planning meetings. Hopefully these cards are still based on what the customer wants, they're just not directly created by the customer. And a lot of teams have both. They have planning meetings where they do some internal planning, and they have a service desk where their customers can reach them directly. So that's how cards are often created. As for who creates the cards, that actually harkens back to the Kanban principles. Kanban encourages acts of leadership at all levels, meaning it shouldn't just be managers creating cards for their team. All team members should be empowered to create cards, and the team should be empowered to pull the cards they're ready to work on into the workflow. I want to close with a brief discussion on how to size Kanban cards. How much work should each card be? I've learned from my experience that I do about 1 card per day. So when I'm writing them, I think about them being 6 to 8 hours of work. And this is a good baseline. It's where I would start. Write cards that your team can move forward about every day or 2. Now, there's no hard and fast rules, so just start there and see what happens. You might have to make changes, and that's okay.
Okay. So you feel like you have some idea about how that works? There is another video here about work in progress limits, which generally are involved in Kanban, where you say you only want to have so many items in a column. I'll go ahead and let you watch that one on your own time, just because maybe won't be as important for what we're going to do in class. But the general idea is that you say there can only be so many items in progress, there can only be so many items in any given state, is the gist of it. So you kind of seem like this. Usually Kanban boards end up a little bit like so. So you can see that we've got columns. You can see we've got cards that go into there. The general recommendation I would say for you to start, like he was saying, for sure you need a kind of a to-do or planning column, and then an in progress and a done column. What you have there in between, you might want to create a blocked column in there just to say, here I can put anything that's like waiting for some external, is waiting for something. So you have a way to track, you know, what are those things that are waiting. And there's a lot more columns than this in a real world scenario usually. And a lot of these, this is one of those things that comes up a lot in those retrospective meetings. The sprint retrospective where we talk about, well, how are we going to, is our Kanban board serving our purpose? Can we change something about that to maybe work better? Because a lot of times one of those things that I've seen come up is, oh, well, we need another checkpoint. We need another place to monitor the status, because really what we're doing is this column almost represents two states. So when you find out that that's happening, that it's getting stuck here because of something, or you need a better way of monitoring what's actually happening, you'll split that, add another column, and say, now we can track that. That makes sense? Usually comes out of what your actual process is.
What are some examples of another column?
So code review is one of those ones that comes up a lot. A lot of times, so code review is somebody else has to look at the code and approve it. That makes sense. Another developer has to look at the code and say that it's good. Another column in there might be for testing. QA has to pass it. Or QA may have to write a test for it and then pass that test. So they might have two columns in there that they've written the test for it and then they've passed it. Does that make sense? If you go back to the waterfall sort of mechanism, that's another good place to start. Just think about, put all those states in waterfall. So you start with requirements, and then design, and then implementation, testing, deployment, and maintenance. So that's another way you can structure that, because oftentimes things break out that way in the end. A lot of teams start moving, you just start with just the 3 columns, but you eventually usually start moving a lot closer to as many columns as you saw in waterfall, if not more. Does that make sense? It comes more as you get more people involved. And it's usually a case of, if 5 people have to do something on this item for it to be done, well, then you usually end up with 5 columns. It's usually roughly correlated with the number of people that are involved. But it might be 2 or 3 times that, simply because sometimes those people do 2 or 3 different things along the way. So, if you haven't started a Trello account, please go create one. Because what I want to go through right now is the basics of how to set up a Trello board. If you have created one, then just go ahead and log in. We'll be there shortly. So I've got a bunch of boards in there already.
So I've done this for a lot of different projects. But you want to just create a brand new form. Let's see, are you signed up?
Yeah.
We're going to follow. Call this final project. AWD 11111 final project.
AWD 111. New team. And this is going to be okay. So yeah. Call it Find a Project, call it whatever you want. I'm calling it a more complicated name just because I've got a bunch of these in here and I'll probably be creating another one next here. So once you get this open, you just make sure that everybody's there. You'll see an option to add a list.
Where do you automatically add it? Mine will automatically added 3.
So again, the way I created a new board was up here on the plus side. I called it Final Project. If you already have one in there, you can rename it just by clicking on the name. I'm going to add a few lists by clicking in here. So I'm going to add my first list. We're going to call this planning. Actually, I'm going to call this backlog. Backlog, planning, progress, done. That's a good start. Feel free to add and rename columns as you need. The biggest thing I would stress, though, you want to have a backlog column on the left, and that's anything that you possibly need to do. Planning is kind of stuff you want to work on, I would say maybe do today, or you could think of this as maybe today, things you want to do today, in progress, and then things that you've completed. So the idea is that you're going to create all the items you need to do over in the backlog, and then move them through as you get through that process, right? So we were talking about Ajax. So you might say, discuss Ajax features with instructor. So you can type in there, give it a name, hit enter. That's now created an item, and you can just drag it around as need be. So I'm going to put that under the to-do column. I can also go through here and do a few things. So first of all, I can change the members. I can change who's it's assigned to. So here I'm going to go assign it to me, and you can see that there. You can also see it up here, that's who it's assigned to. And that's important when you're working with more than one person again. You can also go into labels, and this helps categorize what kind of work items they are. And the way I usually categorize these is I'll break this into a few different categories. So for instance, I might have one for features. I might have another one for bugs. I might have another one for like refactors, which would be I need to change the code. So big new features you want to build, bugs you might want to create. There might also be documentation in here. And what was the other one? Refactors. So that can help to categorize by having different colors there. That can you can categorize your items based on what they are. Maybe I should make bugs red.
I had one for models using controllers too.
I would, so going from I've talked about, vertical slices. Every work item you put in there should be a vertical slice. So every work item you put in there should include models using controllers. You don't want to split those out.
I mean, what if it's just like a UI fix? Like I have something here that I
What you wouldn't do again, vertical slices. What you can do is put in a checklist, and there you can put model view controller. Does that make sense? Model controller. Because the fact that it's done necessarily means that it's done from the user's perspective, not from your perspective, but from the user's perspective. Does that make sense?
What do you mean done? Like
so when you move this, as you finish this, you're going to move it over to working on to done. When it's done, it must be done from the user's perspective. That's really important as far as being able to really track things. Does that make sense? So you can break things out individually like that. You can break the model view and controller by checkboxes, and then you can see, okay, I finished the model and the controller shows me 2 of 3. That's okay, but you want to keep these as vertical slices. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I get that when you're like implementing new features, but if I find just a simple UI bug, I'm not going to really involve the controller. Okay,
then that's part of your checklist for that item. Does that make sense? The bug is the actual item. Don't break it up by what part of the software you're changing. Break it up based on what you're doing. Part of that is because usually when you're dealing with cards like this, every card only ever belongs to one person. Okay? That makes sense?
Yeah.
Every card belongs to one and only one person. So you want to break it up in such a way that you're not breaking it up in a similar way where there's a dependency between 2 cards, ideally. So like if you have a change that needs to happen on the model, you need to add a column here. Well, that also means to change the controller and the view. All of that needs to be captured together.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you make sure from a user's point of view, once that's done, it's actually done. And you can keep track of work that needs to be done with that checklist, but from the user point of view, it being done needs to mean it's done. You can also go in there and add things like due dates. So I could say, well, this needs to be done tomorrow. That will give me a due date there, and that's generally those parts that you need to pay attention to. Any questions more questions as far as Trello is concerned? I really, what I want you to see you do, what I want to see you do with this is to write down all the work that you are in the progress of doing or planning to do. And that way you can kind of capture and see what's left and where are you at in that process. And it helps keep track from day to day, what are those things that you're working on or haven't been done yesterday, right? Because sometimes it's hard to keep track of all those things. How helpful has this been with Learn to Earn?
Very.
You know, could we have built Learn to Earn without this?
Yes, but we wouldn't be as far.
Yeah, well, you would have to meet with me every all the time to try and figure out, and I'd have to remember everything in my head of everything that we've worked on. So this is a really, really valuable tool, and I think I did put points. I think I did mention on the final project that I want you guys to create it, but that's the gist of it. So. Let's see, I think I still had a thing or two on the list. So that's Kanban Boards. There is a video here, which is worth watching. I'm not going to play it here. You can watch it on your own time. Talks about Kanban versus Scrum and how those kind of fit together. And again, people usually end up doing a hybrid of both. The main difference between formal Kanban by itself versus Scrum by itself is it doesn't have those sprints. It doesn't have Kanban by itself does not have a strict beginning and an end. But that rhythm is often helpful in working with software. Another tool that you commonly see people work with in Agile is to do something called pair programming, especially in something called XP or Extreme programming. Pair programming means that you have two people sitting at the same computer writing software simultaneously. And just on the surface, having two people working on the same program, but only one of them kind of coding might seem inefficient, right? But you have to realize that a lot of times there is, whether you're working alone or not, at some point somebody else has to look at it and review it and make sure it's good. So usually sometimes it's going to go through code review. And that's what this is meant to speed up. Is it's meant to write better code and write better code at the beginning and encourage communication. It can also be a tool for learning because it means that if you're both working and actively engaged, you're both learning how it works. You're both learning about the system. Again, only if it's done right. So formally, as far as how this works, one person's considered the driver. They're writing the code. And the other person is considered the navigator. And they're kind of reviewing every line of code as it's written and thinking, and they're bouncing thoughts off between each other as that's happening. It's very important that the navigator is not on their phone. If you're doing pair programming and one of you is looking at your cell phone, you are doing it wrong. And I can't say how many times I've seen people do that. Or not understand that both people need to be just as active.
Is this common?
Huh?
Is this common?
This is reasonably common. Not every company does it. Not every company. Some companies do it on the very, very regular, like most of the time. Other companies just do it as needed. But it's something to have in your tool bag because it's very helpful, especially as a new developer. There's a lot of things you can learn if you take advantage of it, especially if you're playing the role of the navigator. It gives you a chance to kind of see the person working and start to understand and unfold some of the complexities that go into that application that you might not be aware of otherwise. Again, make sure you're not on your phone. There's often a switch in there. It shouldn't be just, this person's the driver all the time and this person's the navigator. You're usually switching back and forth whenever it makes sense. But the idea there is then you end up making better code because you've got two people, two heads, two eyes at it and thinking about, well, the big part that the navigator should be thinking about is the direction, the overall architecture. Like, should we put this function in this class, or should we put this function in that class, or what are the other things that we've broken right now? You know, there's a lot of things to keep in mind than just what's the next line of code. So the navigator is meant to help with those.
Have you done this, like, in your experience?
We've done a little bit of it. It's been a lot less successful than I'd like it, simply because the people I've done it with didn't have enough training on it to know how to do it well.
Do you like it?
It works really well it can work very well. When you have the right two people together. Fair forewarning, BO is one of those things you have to pay attention to, body hygiene, because you're sitting next to a person. You know, yes, so you kind of pick and choose as you're doing that, and you probably don't want to be doing this 24/7.
Right.
You know, you don't want to do this all the time, but it's a very good thing to do in general, as long as you're both productive and focused. It can be, if you're doing it right, it can be a little bit more draining than just working by yourself, because it's a little bit higher pressure, a little bit higher pace you're trying to push yourself to, at least if you're doing it right. Because if you're, the biggest hurdle there is having the navigator making sure that they're engaged and making sure that that mechanic works. The other thing you kind of have to do is you have to make sure that the two people, you can do this again with training, with, you know, as far as, you know, put a senior developer with a junior developer, but it is usually a little bit more productive if there's a little bit more even footing between the two people. So if you put somebody that's at a different level, or, you know, this person that's been at the company 5 years and this person that's been here a week, they're not really even. You know, they're not really even in productivity, so they won't necessarily be able to function both ways as far as navigator or driver. Don't put them in the box of, like, the youngest person should always be driver, the youngest person should always be navigator, but just recognize that it's not going to be as quick or as valuable in that case. Another tool that's out there, and this is a little bit outside the realm of software development, because it can be used for a lot more, and is a little bit more organizational focused. It's called Lean Coffee. So in Lean Coffee, it's meant for kind of having a meeting and making sure that the things that are important get discussed. So it's a way for, rather than coming to a meeting with an agenda and saying we're going to talk about these things, Lean Coffee is a way to have a meeting that doesn't initially have agenda, but everybody that comes to the meeting kind of builds the agenda. So you start with everybody in the team. So you're going to create a Kanban board first of what are you going to discuss, currently discussing and discussed. Everybody creates topics or cards or things they want to be discussed. And then once that happens, everybody can use 2 or 3 dots to vote on all the cards that are out there. And then you go basically by the number of people number of votes on the card. That makes sense? So if the card's got the most votes, we start with that, and then we go from kind of the top, the most voted item down. And that way you kind of get different topics that are important to the people. And that works really well, especially when you've got things like organizational change, figuring out. This is really good at capturing things like, why are your employees unhappy? which seem kind of vague, or what do we need to go with our software, what new tools, what new things do we need to learn. So they're really good at a way of getting input, hearing from what do your employees think. This is not so much a tool that you use with your customers, it's more a tool that you use with your employees. Another thing to note, Scrum's great, works decently well, but it doesn't work well at scale. It doesn't actually scale well past one 6-person team. You can maybe use it with 3 teams, but once you start getting a much larger group of people, like one of the companies I worked at where we had 100 developers, well, things start breaking down with just Scrum. So there's something out there called the Scaled Agile Framework, which is designed to kind of put a lot of pieces together and works a lot better at scale. So there's a lot more processes and things around it. I won't really go into what it is. It's worth spending some time reading up on it if you do end up in that scenario where you're with a lot of teams. There's a lot of useful nuggets. We spent, I think the company that I was working at, we spent like a whole week. We brought them in and spent a whole week learning about this. It's quite helpful at that scale, but it's just a matter of putting a lot of different ideas and methodologies together and figuring out how to make that work when you've got teams that are not in the same place, or you've got release cycles that are, well, we release every 6 months, all those kind of different mechanics and such, and how to coordinate those. So that's what I've got to kind of talk about methods. So, just a review. Give me the different roles that we talked about for the development team. Huh? Huh? So Scrum Master, that came up. What's the Scrum Master do?
Make sure the meeting happens.
Make sure what?
The meeting happens.
Meeting happens. More generally, he makes sure that we follow the Scrum process. That the Scrum process in the meetings and all of those things go as they're supposed to.
And the project manager, but their name's too boring.
They're what?
The project manager, but their name is too boring.
So they're a little bit project manager. Oftentimes, reality, the project manager and Scrum Master aren't really the same thing. We also have a product manager. What else?
Developers.
Stakeholders.
So we talked about developers. What are stakeholders, Graham?
People who have vested interest in the product, anywhere from CEO, CFO, CEO, clients, product manager.
Okay. Alex, you had
I was going to say all of the people that care about the quality of the program.
That's what I want to hear. All the people that care about the quality and the features. They care about how good is the software and what can it do, what can it do. Okay, what else? Is that it?
The business analyst?
So BA, business analyst, yeah.
Quality analyst?
Quality analyst, also known as a tester.
The graphic designer.
Graphic designers. What else? UX designer.
CEOs.
Okay. All right, so there's the executives, which, as he kind of said, get in the way usually. Not wrong. What else? So I talked about different areas, right? What were those different areas? Different responsibilities. So these are like job titles, but more broadly. Yep.
So you saying the navigator and
So we're talking about pair programming.
yeah,
Which was the driver and the navigator. What I'm asking is what's the breakdown of like people at your business? What kind of specialties are there? So these are roles, but they fit into specialities usually. And the kind of areas, business areas.
Oh, like your dev team, your
Okay, so there's development, yeah,
quality assurance team.
yeah. There's a QA team. DevOps. Okay, which is a mix of development and what else?
Operations.
Operations. Okay. What else? There's one very important one that's missing from that list. Very, very important. They'd be very sad that you forgot about them.
Business.
The business, right? Business.
Who cares about
Well, business cares about business, and they're the people that pay your salary.
Fair enough.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other areas in there? Who makes your website look good?
Designer.
Your designers, right? So graphics and UI. So, okay. What does SDLC stand for?
software development lifecycle?
Okay, so somebody else tell me what that means. What's this SDLC?
For the life of your application until it dies.
Okay. What happens along that timeline?
You develop it, use it, you change it.
We have documentation. We have what else? We have to write a bunch of documents along the way as part of our life cycle. What else happens in there then? We have sign-offs. Different people have to sign off on the work being done. We may have Kanban boards that we use to manage it, yada yada. You kind of think of every time we move from one column to another, we're kind of signing and saying it's done. That move from left to right is you kind of putting your signature on to say, hey, I did it. What is waterfall? Alex.
It's a model for progressing through a project that's effective with construction, but not with developing software.
Okay. What are some of the parts of that waterfall model? What are some of the phases? Ben? What are some of the phases of the waterfall model?
I don't know.
Okay. You don't know any of them? Okay. Care to take a stab at one of them? All right. Jeremy, you had your hand up.
So
designing and planning?
So there was a planning, which we usually call requirements. There is design, yes. Okay, so they give me another one.
Implementation.
Next one.
Testing.
Okay. What else?
Deployment.
Okay. What else?
Maintenance.
Maintenance. So in Waterfall, do they ever happen in a different order than what I put on the board? Can I follow through them in out of order? I cannot. So in Waterfall, they have to go from the first thing to the end, and you can't skip. When we're dealing with things in Agile, what you're going to see is typically we basically do these in tight little loops, where especially with Scrum, one sprint is going through that whole process. So we're going through that whole process in a very short, compressed time, in maybe 1 or 2 weeks. Okay. So what can you tell me about Agile? Now you've had some intro to Agile. What can you tell me about it? What is it?
Tight development cycles, usually 1 to 2 weeks.
Okay. That's Scrum.
Right.
Kanban actually doesn't follow necessarily that structure.
It's a development. It's a different. Okay, it basically condenses the waterfall approach into sprints that can last 1 to 2 weeks and focus on specific stories or problems or features or bugs to implement into the
Again, that's Scrum, which Scrum is a kind of Agile. But Agile is a more general term.
Good documentation.
Huh?
Good documentation.
Good documentation?
And
So are you saying Agile has better documentation than Waterfall?
yeah.
Like the methods, like by which they do the development, like
Okay.
things they hold more valuable.
Okay, so yeah, there's some of those. What was that on? Things they hold more valuable. What was that part of?
Agile Manifesto.
Cool. So the Agile Manifesto gives us kind of the core fundamentals of what defines Agile. Okay. So given that, what's important in Agile?
Learning from people and the things you're doing versus tools and that kind of thing.
So instead of following a formalized process of we have to do this, this, and this, and this, and this, which we still do some of that, but we don't focus on that as much as we focus on the people and their needs, right? And we're focused on iteration, which means we're getting feedback sooner, right? We don't wait 2 years to show them the product. We don't wait 2 years to tell them that they don't like it. We wait 2 weeks and then say, hey, do you like this? Why do we do that? Why do we show them it sooner and more often?
The further you get down the wrong way, the harder it is to get back.
That's one reason.
Transparency with the customers.
It's a big reason. Yeah, because if they're seeing where you're at every 2 weeks, they're much more likely to trust you and understand where you're at in the process, rather than if you don't see them for a few months, you don't build that trust up with them to know that you're doing the work and you're producing what they want. Yeah, and a big part of that is responding to change too, because once you get the customer in there, they're going to tell you they want you to do something different than what you're presently doing. So you have to incorporate that feedback and do something different. So we covered a few Agile practices. We've heard about Scrum. What are some of the other ones?
Yeah, there was Kanban.
Kanban. Mm-hmm. What else? The other ones I kind of skimmed over pretty quickly.
What was one the lean coffee thing?
Lean coffee, which is, what was lean coffee?
Was it the one where you have like stories that are voted on, kinda?
It's, the best way to define it is it's a way to have an agenda-less meeting. You don't come to the meeting with an agenda. The agenda is made by the participants, which means that you have actually usually a lot more productive meetings. But it also means they're more open-ended. Okay. What else? So Scrum, Kanban, lean coffee.
Pair programming.
Pair programming. Anything else? Mentioned briefly. I think that's the most of it. I did also touch briefly on Scaled Agile framework. So that's as far as that goes on teamwork. There's a lot of different tools that are out there. This is really good stuff to ask your employers at in an interview. You know, especially when employers are here on the presentation, absolutely ask them about these things. You know, ask them how they do these things. And because the kind of tools and methods that they use here have a really big impact on the work environment, right? And the work environment is probably the most important thing that you can ask for in an interview. If you're going to ask them questions, ask them about their work environment. Ask them, how do they get work done? You know, do they use Agile? Do they use Kanban boards? How many columns do they have in there? How many people on their team? How does their team break out? You know, who's the Scrum Masters? Who are those people? You know, because a lot of those things will impact how you do work and the environment, and should be things that you're asking about before you even started the job. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to shut this down.